It's been 16 years since I first pinned on the badge in Mill Creek. 16 years of service to a town that barely registers on most maps of West Virginia. A population of 853 according to the faded sign at the town limits, though I suspect we haven't broken 800 in at least a decade. I never planned to stay here this long. After the academy, I figured I would put in my time and gain some experience and then move on to a larger department where things actually happened. Where being a cop meant more than breaking up the occasional bar fight or chasing teenagers away from the abandoned mine. But something about this place gets in your blood. The mist that hangs in the valleys on cold mornings. The way the mountains seem to watch you, ancient and patient. The quiet that can feel either peaceful or suffocating. And of course, there are things that happen here. The things that don't make it into my official reports. The things that keep me awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my cabin, listening to the woods outside. The things that make me wonder if leaving would even be possible anymore. The first incident happened about 3 months after I had started. A routine call about a disturbance at one of the trailers out past the old sawmill. Domestic disputes were common enough, especially toward the end of the month when money got tight. My training officer, Sergeant Madsen, had shown me the ropes on a few of these already. "Remember, rookie," he'd say in that gravelly smoker's voice of his. "Folks around here handle their business their own way. It's been like that for generations. We're just here to make sure that nobody gets killed." And Dale was a Mill Creek lifer born and raised, a third-generation lawman. His grandfather had been sheriff back when coal was still king in these parts. He knew everybody in town, knew their parents, their grandparents, knew which families feuded and which ones intermarried so many times that their family trees didn't branch so much as circle back on themselves. The call that night came from a neighbor who had reported screaming at the Willow residence. Ah, crap. Dale sighed when the address came through on our ancient radio. The Willows again. "Problems?" I asked. "Yeah, Johnny Willow got a temper when he drinks. My wife's called us out a few times, but she always recants by morning. Family's been in these mountains since before the revolution. They keep to themselves mostly." And we pulled up to a single wide trailer set back from the road, an old Chevy pickup on blocks in the yard. The porch light was on, but the rest of the place was dark, too dark for just after sundown. "Looks quiet now," I said. Dale was frowning, which I had already learned was unusual for him. "It's too quiet. No dog barking. They have a dog. A mean old blue tick hound. Never shuts up when strangers come around." We approached cautiously. The front door hung slightly ajar. "Police, anybody home?" Dale called out. Nothing, not even the creak of floorboards. The interior of the trailer smelled of cigarettes, a cheap beer, and something else, coppery and thick in the back of my throat. When Dale's flashlight beam swept across the living room, I saw the blood, spattered on the walls, pooled on the linoleum floor, handprints dragged along the hallway wall. But no bodies. We cleared the trailer room by room. Signs of a struggle everywhere, a broken lamp, overturned furniture, more blood in the bedroom. But no Johnny Willow, and no Mrs. Willow. And strangest of all, there were these crude stick figures made of twigs hanging from the ceiling and scattered all across the room. Dale stared at it for a long moment and then keyed his radio to call for backup. But before he could speak, we had heard it. A sound from outside that made the hair on my neck stand up. Singing. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, coming from the woods behind the trailer. Dale's face went pale. "We need to go, now." "What do you mean? We can't leave the crime scene." "This isn't a crime scene, son. This is something else. Something that we don't want any part of." The singing grew louder, and with it came the sound of footsteps in the underbrush. multiple sets circling the trailer. I drew my weapon. "Dale, what's going on?" He grabbed my arm with surprising strength for a man in his 50s. "Listen to me carefully. We're going to walk, not run back to the cruiser. We are going to drive away and we're going to forget that we ever came out here tonight." "But..." "No. Some things in these mountains you don't mess with. The Willows made their choice a long time ago." He looked at the figures again, and it seems they finally paid their debt. I wanted to argue to insist that we do our jobs, but something in Dale's eyes stopped me. Fear. Pure primal fear from a man that I had never seen flinch, not even during a standoff with a meth head waving a shotgun the week before. We left, drove back to the station in silence. Dale wrote up the report himself: domestic disturbance, no contact made, premises appeared vacant. 2 days later, Johnny Willows showed up for his shift at the lumberyard like nothing had happened. When another deputy asked him about the disturbance call, he just smiled and said that his wife had gone to stay with their sister out of town. No one ever saw Mrs. Willow again, and I never saw the Willows' blue-tick hound again either. Dale retired 8 months after that, heart problems officially, but I would catch him sometimes staring off into the mountains with a haunted look. Before he left, he pulled me aside. "Hey, you're a good cop, Jim. You're smart. But there's things about Mill Creek that you need to understand." He pressed an old notebook into my hands. My grandfather's. He kept records of incidents, things that didn't go in the official reports. Read them, learn from them, and when the time comes, add to it. I started reading the notebook that night. Page after page of bizarre occurrences dating back to the 1920s. Children vanishing near the old quarry, only to return days later speaking languages that nobody recognized. Hunters finding mutilated animals arranged in geometric patterns. Strange lights on the ridge above the mine in the weeks before the collapse that killed 27 men in 1953. And names, family names that kept appearing throughout. Willow, Simmons, Carver, Webb, Mason. The oldest families in the region, all connected to incidents that defied explanation. The final entry in Dale's grandfather's handwriting simply read, "They're coming through again. God help us all." It was dated the day before the mine collapse. Dale had continued the notebook, his neat block letters picking up where his grandfather had left off. More disappearances, more strange phenomena, and a pattern that I couldn't ignore. These incidents seemed to cluster around certain dates. Solstices, equinoxes, and one date that appeared more than any other. October 31st. Halloween was 3 weeks away when Dale had given me the notebook, and according to his notes, this Halloween would mark exactly 70 years since the mine collapse. My first few years as a Mill Creek police officer taught me the delicate balance of knowing when to look away. The Webb's still up in the North Hollow. As long as they kept their moonshine business small and didn't sell to minors, I had more important things to worry about. The monthly gatherings at Old Man Carver's farm, where cars with out-of-state plates would arrive after midnight. None of my business, as long as everybody was consenting and no one got hurt. But when 16-year-old Emily Mason went missing in my 4th year on the force, I couldn't ignore it. Even when Chief Wilson, who had replaced Dale, suggested she probably just ran off with friends to go party or something like so many local kids did. That Mason girl was trouble waiting to happen, he said, and barely looking up from his paperwork. Give it a week and she'll call her parents asking for bus fare home. But Emily wasn't like the other restless teenagers. She was the valedictorian of her class, had a full ride lined up at West Virginia. And there was the matter of the strange carvings in her bedroom windowsill. Symbols that I had seen before in Dale's notebook. I drove out to the Mason place after my shift. Her parents were hollow-eyed with worry, clutching each other on their sagging couch as I asked questions the department should have asked days ago. "When exactly did you last see Emily?" Mrs. Mason twisted a tissue in her hands. "Tuesday evening. She said that she was going to study at the library, but when she wasn't home by 9, I called Marjorie, who works there. She said that Emily never showed up." "Did she take anything with her? Clothes, toiletries, her phone?" "Nothing," Mr. Mason said. Her phone was still in her desk, charging. Her backpack still in her room. "Has she been acting differently lately? New friends, problems at school?" They exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret. "Well, there was that boy," Mrs. Mason finally said. "The one from up Simmons Way." Mr. Mason's face had darkened. "No daughter of mine would get mixed up with the Simmons." "Emily's been spending time with somebody from the Simmons family." "I told her to stay away from that boy," Mr. Mason said. "Nothing good ever came from that family. They're not right, never have been." I made a note. "Do you know which Simmons specifically?" "Nathan," Mrs. Mason supplied. "He's about Emily's age, keeps to himself at school from what I hear, but lately he's been talking to Emily between classes." The Simmons lived deep out in the forest, rarely coming to town except for supplies. I had had minimal contact with them, and just an occasional traffic stop or public intoxication call involving one of the older Simmons men. They were insular, suspicious of outsiders, and according to Dale's notebook, present at nearly every unexplained incident in Mill Creek's history. I thanked the Masons and promised that I would do everything I could to find their daughter. On the way out, I noticed a small garden stone by their front steps, a simple river rock with 3 spirals carved into it. "Huh, that's new," I commented. Mrs. Mason touched her crucifix necklace. "Protection," she whispered. "From them." "Them?" "The ones in the woods," she said, and then quickly closed the door. The road to the Simmons compound wasn't much more than a dirt track, winding through dense forest that seemed to grow darker with every mile. My cruiser's suspension protested as I navigated around potholes and exposed roots. I had radioed in my location before heading out, but Chief Wilson's response had been concerning. "The Simmons? What are you doing way out there?" "Following a lead on the Mason girl." There was a long pause. "Listen to me, you turn around and that's an order. We don't go into the Simmons compound uninvited." "Since when do we need an invitation to investigate a missing person?" "Since always. Trust me on this." I had turned off my radio after that. Some things a badge couldn't ignore, Chief's orders or not. The Simmons property announced itself with a crude wooden sign nailed to a dead oak tree. "Trespassers will be shot," in faded white paint. Beyond it, a cluster of buildings came into view. A main house that had been added onto haphazardly over generations, a large barn with a sagging roof and several smaller outbuildings. No vehicles were visible. No lights on in the windows despite the approaching dusk. But smoke rose from the chimney, and I could hear the faint sound of chickens clucking somewhere nearby. Somebody was home. I parked but left the engine running. Something felt wrong about this place. The air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. Even the birds had gone silent. As I stepped out of the cruiser, the front door of the house opened up. A man emerged, tall, gaunt, with a gray beard reaching down to the middle of his chest. He carried a shotgun casually in the crook of his arm, not quite pointed at me, but not pointed away either. "You're about a mile past where you ought to be, officer," he called out. His voice was surprisingly gentle for such a forbidding figure. "Looking for Nathan Simmons," I replied, keeping my hand visible and away from my holster. "Need to ask him a few questions about a missing girl." The old man's expression didn't change. "No Nathan here." "I have reliable information that Nathan Simmons has been in contact with Emily Mason, who's been missing for 3 days now." "Mason," he repeated as if testing the name. "Don't know any Masons anymore." The way that he emphasized any more sent a chill through me. "Sir, I'm gonna need to speak with Nathan. Is he your son?" A sound like dry leaves scraping on stone. It took me a moment to realize that the old man was laughing. "Son? No, officer. Nathan would be my nephew. I suppose you'd call it." He stepped forward, and I noticed he moved with an odd, halting gait. "The boy's not here, but even if he was, you wouldn't know anything about any missing girl. We keep to ourselves." "Where might I find him then?" The old man's eyes narrowed. "You're not hearing me, officer. We Simmons handle our own affairs. Have done for 300 years in these mountains. Whatever trouble you're looking for, it isn't here." From inside the house came a noise, a thump, followed by what sounded like muffled speech. The old man didn't turn or acknowledge it, but his knuckles had whitened on the shotgun. "What was that?" I asked, hand moving closer to my weapon. "Old house settles, especially when the weather's changing." But the day had been clear and the temperature steady. "You mind if I take a look inside? Won't take but a minute." "You got a warrant, officer?" "No, but I can get one if needed." The old man smiled, revealing teeth too perfect, too white for somebody his age living this far from dental care. "And by the time you get back with a warrant, there won't be nothing here to find." Another sound from inside, louder this time. Definitely a voice, high-pitched in distress. That was enough for me. "Sir, please put the weapon down and step aside." The old man didn't move. "You're making a mistake, son. Walking into something that you don't understand. The only mistake would be ignoring a missing girl. Now put the gun down." For a tense moment, I thought he might raise the shotgun, but instead he carefully laid it against the porch railing and stepped back, hands raised. "On your head be it," he said. "But remember, you were warned." I approached cautiously, keeping my eyes on him while calling out, "Police, anybody inside, make yourself known." The house's interior was dim, lit only by a few oil lamps and the dying fire in a massive stone hearth. The furnishings were little and ancient, hand-carved wooden chairs, a table worn smooth by generations of use. The walls were lined with shelves holding hundreds of glass jars filled with unidentifiable contents, roots, herbs, things that looked like preserved animal parts. "Emily?" I called out. "Emily Mason." A muffled sound came from upstairs. I moved toward the narrow staircase, gun drawn now. "Stay where I can see you," I ordered the old man, who merely shrugged and settled into a rocking chair by the fire. "Oh, go on up," he said, that same eerie smile playing on his lips. "See what you find." The stairs creaked ominously under my weight. At the top was a cramped hallway with 4 doors, all closed. The sound came again from the last door on the left. "Emily, it's the police. Are you in there?" Another muffled cry. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. "Stand back from the door," I called, and then I kicked near the lock. The wood splintered easily. The room beyond was small, with a single window covered by heavy curtains. A kerosene lamp on a side table provided the only light, illuminating a scene that made my blood run cold. Emily Mason sat in the center of the floor inside a circle of what looked like salt or ash. Her wrists and ankles were bound with rough twine, a small gag tied around her mouth. But it wasn't her restraints that horrified me. It was her eyes. They were completely black, without iris or white, like pools of oil that reflected the lamplight. Next to her sat a boy about her age, thin, pale, and with long dark hair. He was drawing symbols on the wooden floor with a piece of chalk, consulting an ancient-looking book open beside him. He looked up at my entrance, and I saw that his eyes were normal, wide with surprise and fear. "Nathan Simmons," I trained my gun on him. "Don't move. What are you doing here?" "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm trying to help her." Emily made a strangled noise behind her gag, her head twisting at an unnatural angle to look at me. When our eyes met, a splitting headache lanced through my skull, accompanied by whispered voices speaking in no language that I had ever heard. "What have you done to her?" I demanded, fighting through the pain. "I didn't do anything," Nathan insisted. "She came to me for help. It's inside her." "Untie her now." "I can't. Not until the ritual is complete. If I break the circle now." "Now, kid," I stepped forward, keeping my weapon trained on him as I reached for Emily with my free hand. "No, don't." Nathan lunged for my arm, but it was too late. My hand broke the circle as I reached for Emily's restraints. The lamp flickered violently, the temperature in the room plummeted. Emily's back arched impossibly, her spine bending like a bow drawn too tight. And then she spoke, a voice that wasn't hers, deep and resonant, with that same strange language that I had heard in my head. Nathan scrambled back, grabbing the book. "Oh, now you've done it. It's loose." The whispers in my head grew louder. Emily's body began to twitch and contort, limbs bending at impossible angles. Her skin seemed to ripple as if something underneath it was pushing to get out. Before I could react, the old man appeared in the doorway behind me. "I told you," he said calmly. "Some things, once started, can't be stopped." He pushed past me, moving with surprising speed for somebody his age. From his pocket he produced a small leather pouch, from which he drew a handful of dark powder. "Hold her," he barked at Nathan, who immediately moved to grab Emily's thrashing shoulders. I should have stopped them, should have arrested them both. But the whispers inside my head had become a scream, and I found myself frozen watching as the old man began to chant while sprinkling the powder in a new circle around Emily. Her body went rigid. The black in her eyes seemed to boil and churn. And then with a sound like wet cloth tearing, something began to emerge from her mouth. A writhing, oily darkness that seemed both liquid and solid at once. I retched, the stench of rot and decay overwhelming me. The darkness continued to pour from Emily, forming a shifting pillar of shadow above her. The old man's chanting grew louder. Nathan joined in, their voices harmonizing in that strange language. The darkness swirled faster, seeming to condense. And then abruptly it collapsed inward, disappearing with a sound like distant thunder. Emily slumped to the floor, unconscious but breathing. Her eyes, when they fluttered briefly open, were normal once again, brown irises ringed with white. The old man turned to me, sweat beading on his forehead. "Now you see, officer, some things in these mountains don't fit in your reports." I holstered my weapon with shaking hands. "What was that thing?" "Old as these mountains. Hungry, patient, always looking for a way in." He nodded toward Emily. And girl went looking where she shouldn't, opened a door, and we were trying to close it. Will she be okay?" Nathan was checking her pulse. "She should be. We got most of it out." "Most of it?" my voice said. The old man's eyes met mine. "Once it gets a taste, it never really lets go. Part of it stays, watches, waits." He gestured toward the door. "Take her home. Tell her parents to not take their eyes off of her." The old man reached into his pocket and produced a small stone pendant on a leather cord. "And make her wear this. Never take it off." I took the pendant numbly. "Why are you helping her? Why did you?" "We Simmons have been keeping things in balance for generations. Some call us witches, others worse things. But we're more like gamekeepers. We watch the borders." "Borders to what?" He smiled that unnerving smile again. "Places you don't want to know about, officer." I carried Emily to my cruiser wrapped in a blanket Nathan had provided. She remained unconscious, occasionally murmuring in her sleep. Normal words now, English words, though they made little sense. As I prepared to leave, the old man approached my window. "You'll be seeing more now that you've touched it," he said quietly. "The darkness leaves a mark. It opens your eyes to things that most folks are lucky enough to miss." "What does that mean?" "Means that you're a part of it now. The watching, the keeping." He tapped the center of my forehead with one long bony finger. "It means these mountains have chosen you, whether you like it or not." I returned Emily to her parents that night, told them that she had been found wandering around near the old quarry, disoriented but physically unharmed. I passed on the old man's instructions, presenting Mrs. Mason with the stone pendant. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Yeah, Simmons' work," she whispered, but hung it around her sleeping daughter's neck anyway. Emily recovered, at least outwardly. She returned to school after a week, graduated as planned and went off to university. But occasionally I would see her in town during holidays and there was always something in her eyes. A wariness, a knowledge that shouldn't belong to somebody so young. And she never went out into the woods again. As for me, old man Simmons had been right. I began to see things differently after that night. I noticed patterns in the random calls that came into the station. I recognized markings carved into door frames on certain houses. Understood why some families never went out after dark on certain days of the year. I started making my own entries into Dale's notebook. Began collecting my own protective charms, some purchased discreetly from the Simmons, others from the Webbs who I discovered were more than mere moonshiners. And I learned to trust my instincts when they told me that something wasn't right. Like the night I pulled over a car with Ohio plates off of US 250. The driver had seemed normal enough, clean-cut, middle-aged, a corporate type who claimed he had taken a wrong turn following his GPS. But something about his smile didn't reach his eyes. And when I shined my flashlight into the back seat, I noticed that the upholstery was all scratched up. After staring at it for a second, it almost made my vision blur, and I had to look away. "Everything all right, officer?" he asked, and for a moment I thought that I heard that same whispered language underneath his words. I directed him back to the interstate with a warning, and then followed at a distance to make sure that he actually left town. In my rearview mirror, I could have sworn the headlights of his car flared with an unnatural purple light as he crossed the county line. In my 10th year on the job, I became chief when Wilson retired. By then, I had developed a reputation in town, fair but firm, willing to look the other way on minor infractions, but zero tolerance for anything that might disrupt the delicate balance of the community. The older families respected me. The Simmons nodded when our paths would cross in town. Old Mrs. Webb would leave jars of her special preserve on my porch. It was a viscous amber liquid that burned going down, but man, I couldn't get enough of it. But even with their acceptance, there were incidents that I still couldn't prevent. Like the 3 hikers who went missing along the High Falls Trail in my 12th year as chief. Out-of-towners, graduate students from VT conducting research on the Appalachian forest ecology. Their campsite was found undisturbed, equipment still in their tents, food half prepared over a cold campfire. The only clue was a series of fresh cuts into the nearby trees, the sap still oozing when my deputies had found them. The cuts formed as symbols that I recognized from Dale's notebook, associated with a cluster of disappearances in the 1970s. We organized search parties, brought in dogs from the county seat, and even had a helicopter from the state police assist for 2 days. But there was nothing. On the 7th day of the search, I hiked alone to the ridge above the old mine. There was a clearing there that Dale's notebook had mentioned, a place where the oldest families sometimes held their gatherings. The clearing was surrounded by ancient oak trees whose branches seemed to reach toward each other like grasping hands. At its center stood a flat rock altar weathered by centuries of rain and snow. I wasn't surprised to find Nathan Simmons there, now a man in his 30s with the same lean build as his uncle. He had taken over as the family's primary contact with the outside world after the old man had passed about 5 years earlier. Those students, I said without a preamble. Was it necessary? Nathan didn't insult me by pretending not to understand. They disturbed something, broke a seal that's been holding for 100 years. They were just kids doing research. They were digging, taking core samples from the heart trees. He shook his head. Some trees shouldn't be bled. And for that, they deserve to disappear. Oh, it wasn't punishment, Chief, it was containment. His eyes met mine steady and unblinking. What got into them, it was spreading. We couldn't let them leave the forest. Are they dead then? I finally asked. Nathan was silent for a long moment. Well, not exactly. A chill ran through me despite the summer heat. Well, what does that mean? It means that there are worse things than death, especially in the deep woods. He ran a hand over the altar's smooth surface. Your predecessor understood that, so did his father and his before him. But I'm not like them. I don't look the other way when people disappear. No, Nathan agreed. You're not like them. You've been touched by the darkness, marked by it. He tapped his forehead in the same spot that his uncle had touched mine years ago. That's why you're still here after all this time. These mountains don't let their chosen ones go easily. I wanted to argue, to deny the strange attraction that I felt to this place, but instead I asked, will it happen again? These containments? As long as outsiders come here digging into things that they don't understand, well then yes. His expression softened slightly. But we try to warn them first. The signs on the trails. The locals telling stories about dangerous bears or unstable ground near the old mining areas. Most people do listen. And those who don't, Nathan turned away. They become part of the balance. I left without another word, hiking back down to where I had parked my cruiser. That night, I added a new entry to Dale's notebook, documenting what little I knew about the student's fate. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead from exposure or an animal attack. Their families held a memorial service in the town hall, attended by somber locals who murmured appropriate condolences while avoiding eye contact. And life in Mill Creek continued. And now, after 16 years of wearing the badge in this town, I find myself facing another incident. The anniversary of the mine collapsing. Yesterday, I found Nathan Simmons on my porch before dawn, looking like he hadn't slept in days. It's happening again, he said without greeting, but worse this time. The seals are failing faster than we can repair them. What do you need from me? I asked, already knowing that I wouldn't like the answer. A binding requires blood freely given by one who walks between worlds. His eyes bored into mine. Somebody marked by the darkness but not consumed by it. I felt the scar on my palm from the night that I had broken the circle around Emily Mason all those years ago. My blood. Nathan nodded. At the altar, when the moon is at its highest. And what if I refuse? His expression remained impassive. Then pray you're among the first taken when the door is open. I've been considering his words all day as I drive the quiet streets of Mill Creek. The town feels different. Buildings that have stood for a century suddenly seem temporary, flimsy barriers against the ancient wilderness that surrounds us. The mountains loom larger and darker, as if leaning in to listen to our final conversations. At the station, I've quietly made preparations, authorized overtime for all deputies, distributed shotguns and extra ammunition, established a curfew under the pretense of safety concerns. My deputies think that I'm overreacting, but they don't see what I see, and they haven't read Dale's notebook. They haven't traced the patterns of disappearances and unexplained deaths that have punctuated Mill Creek's history every 70 years like clockwork. Tonight, I have a choice to make. Offer my blood for the binding ritual, tying myself permanently to this place and whatever lurks beyond it, or stand aside and watch as the darkness that has been seeping through for generations finally breaks free completely. Either way, I know that I'll never leave Mill Creek now. These mountains have chosen me just as they chose Dale and his father and grandfather before him. I check my watch. 6 hours until midnight. 6 hours until I meet Nathan at the altar and make my final choice. In the meantime, though, I have to make my rounds. My town to protect for as long as it remains a town and not something else entirely. The sun is setting now and the shadows are lengthening across Main Street. From somewhere deep in the surrounding forest comes a sound. It's not quite a howl, not a scream, but something in between. Something that makes the windows on the cruiser vibrate slightly. I start the engine and head toward the edge of town, toward the dark tree line that marks the beginning of the wilderness. Whatever makes its way through tonight, I'll be waiting. My radio crackles as I approach the tree line. My deputy's voice comes through, tense and staticky. Chief, we've got a situation at the Rusty Nail. Multiple calls are coming in. I key the mic. What is it? Not sure reports of a fight, but there's some weird details. Patrons are saying that the mirrors behind the bar are showing things that aren't there. Bartender claims that the bottles are bleeding. My grip tightens on the steering wheel. The Rusty Nail sits at the intersection on Main and Old Mine Road, directly above what used to be the main shaft of the town mine, before it had collapsed, before 27 miners were entombed. On my way, tell everybody to stay inside and away from the windows. Sir. Just do it, deputy, and don't look at any mirrors. I make a U-turn, tires squealing on the cracked asphalt, and I speed in the direction of the Rusty Nail. The Rusty Nail's neon sign flickers erratically as I pull into the gravel lot. Several patrons huddle outside, their breath fogging in the unexpectedly cold air. Their eyes are wide, faces pale despite the alcohol that must be in their systems. Frank Williamson, the owner, rushes towards my cruiser. Oh, thank God you're here. Something's wrong inside, the mirrors. I know, Frank, get these people away from here. Tell them to go home and lock their doors and stay inside. But do it now, Frank. The urgency in my voice must register because he nods and begins herding the shell-shocked patrons toward their vehicles. In hindsight, not a smart idea, but they couldn't be here right now. I grab my shotgun from the rack and I approach the entrance. Through the windows, I can see the bar is strangely dark despite the overhead lights being on still. My deputy meets me at the door, his young face tight with controlled fear. Chief, I'd tried to secure the scene, but he swallows hard. The mirrors, they're showing things. What exactly? His eyes dart away. People, but they're not right. It's like they have the wrong faces on. and there's something else moving behind them. I nod unsurprised. Dale's notebook had mentioned a similar phenomenon during previous anniversaries. Is anybody still inside? Oh, just old Pete. He was passed out in the back booth when it started. Wouldn't wake up when I tried to move him. Pete Carver, 80 years old and related to every Carver in the county. Known for his knowledge of local lore and his ability to drink anybody under the table. Not somebody that I want caught in the crossfire of whatever's happening. All right, I want you to clear the perimeter, deputy. Keep everybody back at least 100 yards. No, you're not going in alone. That's an order, deputy. Go on now. I ready my shotgun and move towards the door. The door creaks as I push it open. Inside, the temperature drops at least 20 degrees and my breath plumes visibly. Pete, I call out. Pete Carver. A muffled groan from the back booth. I can see his prone form slumped over the table. The bar area itself appears normal at first glance. Stools upturned for closing, glasses drying on racks. But the mirrors, yeah, they're definitely wrong. The massive mirror behind the bar doesn't reflect the room that I'm standing in. Instead, it shows what looks like the same space but decayed and rotting. Floorboards and walls covered in mold. And other dark figures seated at the bar where nobody sits in reality. As I watch, one figure turns slowly toward me. It wears what might have once been a miner's uniform, now tattered and stained with something dark. Its face is obscured, but I can feel it seeing me. Not tonight, I mutter. Not in my town. The figure in the mirror stands, and others turn to follow its gaze. They begin to move toward the mirror's surface from their side, hands reaching out, pressing against the glass as if testing its resistance. I hurry to Pete, keeping my eyes averted from the other decorative mirrors scattered throughout the room. Each one in my vision seems to show different scenes, none of them reflecting the actual room. Pete, come on, wake up. I shake his shoulder roughly. His head lolls and then lifts. His eyes open, but they're glazed and unfocused. Jim? His voice sounds distant, as if speaking from the bottom of a well. They're coming back up, all of them. Hey, we need to go now. I hoist him up, surprised at how light he feels for his size. Too late. Look. Despite my better judgment, I follow his gaze to the mirror above our booth. Instead of our reflections, it shows the interior of a mine shaft. Support beams buckling and dust and rock falling as men scream and scramble in the dim light of headlamps. The mine collapse, happening right now 70 years later in some adjacent reality bleeding through. A crack appears in the mirror, splitting it diagonally from corner to corner. Dark liquid begins to seep through. Not water, too viscous, too red. Pete laughs, a hollow sound. The mountains are bleeding out all of its secrets. A crash from the bar makes me spin around. The large mirror is shattered, but instead of glass falling to the floor, the fragments hover in midair, rotating slowly. Beyond them, where the mirror once stood, is a yawning darkness that doesn't belong. A space that can't exist in the physical layout of the building. Figures move within that darkness, approaching the threshold. I raise my shotgun instinctively, but Pete's hand closes around my wrist with surprising strength. It won't help, he says, suddenly lucid. You can't kill what's already died once. Pete pulls from his pocket and hands me a leather pouch filled with ingredients that I do not recognize. You'll have to use this. I fling the pouch toward the opening behind the bar. The powder within hangs suspended for a moment, glittering in the dim light, and then ignites with a blinding flash. Unearthly screams echo from the darkness as the figures retreat. The mirror fragments drop to the floor, once again just broken glass. It's not gonna hold, Pete says, now standing up under his own power. Not this time. Too many seals are broken. Too much is owed. Owed by whom? His eyes fix on mine. By all of us, this town was built on bargains. Bargains with things older than the mountains themselves. The miners broke the deepest seal in '53, released something that should have stayed buried. The old families, they negotiated a delay. 70 years of peace in exchange for... He trails off. In exchange for what, Pete? Blood, service, kids sometimes. He looks away. My own grandfather was a part of it. I learned things that no man should know to help with the binding. The building groans around us, timbers creaking like we're in the hold of his ship caught in a storm. We need to go, I insist, pulling him toward the exit. Outside, the night is transformed. The sky churns with clouds that glow faintly from within, like lightning trapped in smoke. The air smells of ozone and copper. My deputy and a small crowd of townspeople stand at the perimeter that he established, watching in horrified fascination. Get them out of here, I yell at my deputy as I half-drag Pete toward my cruiser. Chief, what's happening? Before I can answer, a tremor runs through the ground, slight at first and then violent enough to stagger us. Somewhere in the distance, car alarms begin to wail. Earthquake! Somebody in the crowd yells. Pete laughs that hollow laugh again. Waking up. It's waking up. Another tremor, stronger this time. A fissure opens in the gravel parking lot. Steamer smoke rising from its depths. Everybody needs to evacuate. I shout over the growing noise. Deputy, get on the radio. Tell all units to coordinate evacuation toward the county line, east side only. The west road goes too close to the old quarry. Evacuation for an earthquake. I grab his shoulder. Look at me, this isn't an earthquake. I don't have time to explain, but you need to trust me. Get these people out of here, don't stop for anything. Don't let anybody stay behind. Something in my expression must convince him, because he nods sharply and rushes to his patrol car. I help Pete into my cruiser and slide behind the wheel. As I start the engine, he grabs my arm. Where are you taking me? Out of town with the others. He shakes his head. No, take me to the altar. I'm a carver, my blood still means something on a night like this. I stare at him, realizing what he's offering. Pete, you're 80 years old. The ritual would kill you. I'm dying anyway, cancer. Doctor gave me 3 months 2 weeks ago. He meets my gaze steadily. Better go out useful than withering in some hospital bed. Another tremor rocks the cruiser. Through the windshield, I can see the bar's windows glowing with an unnatural light from within. The altar, Pete insists. We need to at least slow it down until the Simmons can complete the main binding. I put the car in drive, a decision made. I'm supposed to meet Nathan there at midnight anyway. Oh good. Pete settles back in his seat. 3 bloodlines are stronger than 2. The drive to the ridge is harrowing. Tremors continue to shake the ground at irregular intervals. Twice, fissures open in the road ahead of us, forcing detours. The forest on either side of the narrow mountain road seems to be alive. Trees swaying despite any wind. Shadows moving between trunks like solid things. At one point, something massive crosses the road ahead. A dark shape larger than a bear, but it's moving all wrong. Its proportions shifting as it disappears into the underbrush. I don't slow down to get a better look. We reach the clearing above the old mine just after 11. The site overlooks the sealed mine entrance where 27 men died 70 years ago tonight. Nathan's already there with the other members of the Simmons family, arranging items into a circle. An old miner's lamp, coal fragments, and what looks like pieces of timber from the original mine supports. It's happening again, Nathan says grimly as we approach. The mountain is restless. The old debt must be acknowledged. The mountain has a long memory, Pete interjects, his voice solemn. The dead want recognition, they want to be remembered. The ground trembles beneath our feet. A low groaning sound emerges from the sealed mine shaft, like metal beams bending under immense pressure. Every 70 years they try to come back, to warn us, to remind us of the price of greed, Nathan continues. He hands us each small objects, old coal miner tags, the kind used to identify workers at shift changes. The metal is cold to the touch and the names and numbers are still visible after decades. The ritual is simple, he explains. We acknowledge the debt, we honor the dead. We promise that their sacrifice won't be forgotten. And if we don't, I ask, then they'll make sure everybody remembers one way or another. They'll walk again among the living, showing their broken bodies their final moments. The town will see what the company tried to bury along with them. Another tremor shakes the mountain stronger this time. From down in town I hear distant alarms, car horns, and building security systems triggered by the shaking. This is more than just restless spirits. I say, remembering the nightmarish scenes at the Rusty Nail. The mirrors, the darkness. Grief and rage have power, Nathan says simply, especially when it's been contained for 70 years. 27 men died in darkness, choking on coal dust, trapped beneath tons of rock. That kind of death that leaves a mark. He gestures to the mining artifacts. We stand as witnesses, representatives of the town that forgot them, the families that profited from their deaths, and the law that looked the other way. The ground shudders violently. A fissure opens near the edge of the clearing, steam rising from its depths. The smell of coal dust fills the air, though the mine hasn't been operational in decades. We take our places. Nathan begins to recite the names of the fallen miners, his voice carrying in the night air. Pete joins in, knowing each name by heart. I stand silently, holding the tarnished identification tag. As the names are spoken, the tremors gradually subside. The fissure stops widening. The groaning from below grows quieter. When the final name is called, Pete steps forward and kneels, placing his hand on the ground. We remember, he says, voice cracking with emotion. We acknowledge the debt. We honor the sacrifice. Nathan and I repeat the words. Something shifts in the atmosphere, a heaviness lifting, the pressure easing. But as Pete tries to stand, he clutches his chest and collapses. Nathan and I rush to him, but I can see immediately that he's gone, his heart finally giving out at this moment of completion. He knew, Nathan says quietly. The carvers always served as the memory keepers. He told me yesterday that if his heart stopped tonight, it would be a good death. We carry Pete's body back to my cruiser with somber respect. Tomorrow, he'll be buried in the Carver family plot, another keeper of Mill Creek's painful history laid to rest. As we descend back toward town, I radio the deputy, calling off the evacuation with a cover story about minor seismic activity from the old mine settling. The townspeople will accept the explanation, they always do. So will it happen again? I ask Nathan as we approach the town. Well, in another 70 years, I would say, he says. The cycle continues until the debt is fully acknowledged. What debt? The mine company's been gone for decades. He gives me a pointed look. Not that debt, the town's debt. Mill Creek was built on coal money. Everybody benefited while looking the other way on safety violations. Everybody pretended not to know what the company was doing. So we just do this every 70 years and that's it. Well, no, Nathan says, his expression grave. The ritual buys time, but the debt grows. Each time the signs come earlier, the manifestations become stronger. One day the ritual won't be enough. Well, what then? Then Mill Creek will have to face its past completely. The truth will have to be known by everyone, not just the old families who keep the secrets. I drop Nathan off at the edge of town. Before he exits the cruiser, he places a small wooden box on the dashboard. Coal dust from the original collapse, he explains. If you start seeing signs, mirrors showing the inside of the mine, dreams of being trapped underground, use this. It connects you to them, lets you hear their warnings. Their warnings? The mountain is full of more than just old ghosts, Chief. The mining company didn't just awaken the dead with their greed. They disturbed something older, something that's been sleeping in the deep veins since before the first settlers came here. I watch him disappear into the darkness, his words settling uneasily in my mind. The old mine has always been more than just a tragic accident in the town's history. It's been a presence looming over Mill Creek. I drive back to the station, turning the miner's identification tag over in my fingers. James Carver, number 17. Pete's grandfather, I realize. One of the 27. The notebook waits in my desk drawer. I pull it out, flipping to Dale's entries about the mine. The company dug too deep. Found a seam that should have been left untouched. Black coal that wasn't coal at all. I had my own entry documenting tonight's events. As I write, I catch movement in the corner of my eye. A dark silhouette of a man wearing a miner's helmet. When I turn, there's nothing there, but the smell of coal dust lingers. Just a reminder, the ghosts are quieted but not at peace. Not yet. I grab my pen and continue writing. 70 years since the mine collapse, the anniversary ritual was performed, though not without a cost. Tomorrow I'll be training my deputy more intensely. In time, perhaps he'll be ready to understand what being a cop in Mill Creek really means. That we're not just keeping the peace among the living. After all, in this small town, strange things will keep on happening. They always have and they always will. Today's episode is sponsored by Cornbread Hemp. Have you been looking for a natural way to relieve aches and discomfort? The CBD gummies from Cornbread Hemp are formulated to work with your body, not against it. I'm still fairly young, but as I've gotten older, I've been feeling a lot more aches and pains that seem to pop up. But since taking some gummies from Cornbread Hemp, that discomfort is much more manageable. Cornbread Hemp's CBD gummies are made to help you feel better, whether it's stress, discomfort, or just needing a little relaxation. They only use the best part of the hemp plant, the flower, for the purest and most potent CBD. Right now, Creepscast listeners can save 30% on their first order. Just head to cornbreadhemp.com/MrCreeps and use code MrCreeps at checkout. That's cornbreadhemp.com/MrCreeps and use code MrCreeps. It was just another normal walk. That's how it started anyway. A casual morning stroll on the forested trail that ran behind my parents' house. They own a home on a couple acres in the small town of Skyline, Alabama. At the time, I was in between jobs and had been living with them as I tried to get back on my feet. Their property intersects with a winding trail that ran for miles through some unkempt woods in the boonies. In the morning, the Appalachian hills would come alive with the songs of birds and fluttering of insects. The crimson sunrise would paint a beautiful portrait as it filtered down through the bristling leaves of aspen and spruce trees. There was something about the place that just made me feel at peace. It was like all the stress and anxiety of modern-day worries just faded away. It was my Zen place, until the day it was shattered forever. The day it happened, I woke up a bit before dawn, had my coffee, and went out for an early morning walk. The sun had just begun to creep over the horizon when I left the house. I hadn't planned on being gone any longer than an hour, and had only been walking about 15 minutes when I noticed something strange. The path around me was oddly silent, with the only noise coming from the sounds of my own footsteps against the gravel. The usual sounds of the woodland creatures or the wind gently rustling the trees were absent. Everything was just completely silent. It didn't really bother me at first, but the longer that it went on, the stranger it seemed. I finally stopped to try and determine whether it was some auditory illusion of some kind. I listened for any of the usual sounds. Cars on the highway a few miles out, lawnmowers fired up by the neighbors, or just any noise at all. But there was nothing, just silence. All of a sudden, I began to feel lightheaded. My vision started swimming and my knees grew wobbly beneath me. The hairs on my arms stood on end and a cold sweat dampened my brow. I didn't understand what was happening, but in seconds, I was struggling just to remain standing. Panic struck hard, and I desperately reached for my phone thinking that I was having a medical emergency. I never managed to reach it, and I just seemed to lose all control of my body and fall face first to the ground. I still don't know exactly what happened, but it must have been a seizure or a fainting spell of some kind. What I do know is that when I finally came to, I wasn't where I was before. The environment was pitch black and suddenly cold. Only when I struggled and felt my knee knock into something solid did I realize that I was awake. The sudden jolt struck right on the funny bone, causing me to wince out in pain. I tried to reach my hand out to rub the aching nerve, but found that I couldn't. There was something restricting my movement, something cold and covered in a sticky substance. My whole body was pinned vertically against a wall. Thankfully, the binds were not entirely restrictive, and I managed to finagle the cell phone out of my pocket. I flipped it open and the light glowed in the dark. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me to see where I was at, and that's when the true dread set in. As far as I could tell, I was in some sort of underground tunnel. The binds that restricted me looked almost like the roots of trees. They felt different though, more like dried mud than a plant. They were grayish in color and coated with random splotches of this greenish and black goo. It was sticky like tree sap, and it hung in gobs of tendrils from all over that smelled truly foul. I almost had a panic attack in that moment, as I realized I had absolutely no idea where I was or how I had gotten there. My initial thought was that there was some weird cave-in or earthquake, which somehow led to me ending up where I did. I shined my phone up at the ceiling but saw only the rigid outline of the rocky walls, no fissure or gap that I could have slid through, and thus that potential explanation died a quick, unceremonious death. My next thought was that I had been abducted by someone. I thought about yelling for help, but if that were true, then I doubted they would be likely to come to my aid. I realized an explanation in that moment was not nearly as important as actually getting out. After wiggling back and forth a bit, it was clear that it wasn't going to be enough to escape. I shined the phone around the corridor using what little lighting it provided to try and formulate a plan. I caught a break when the light gleamed off of some shiny metallic object only a few feet to my right. It was too far for my hand to reach, and so I extended my right foot out as much as I could. After struggling for a few minutes, I finally managed to dig my heel down on top of it and drag it back towards me. I then managed to press it against the wall and move it vertical so that I could reach it with my hand. It was some sort of bent iron rod. I didn't know how it had possibly gotten down there, but I was nonetheless happy it had. After slowly wedging it into one of the rods, I managed to push outward and cause it to crack. The roots, or whatever they were, crumbled with relative ease. A few of them broke away, and within a couple of moments, I managed to push my arm free. Soon after, I managed to slide my entire body up and out of the hole that I had created. Somehow it was only then that I remembered my phone was good for something besides shining a flashlight. I dialed 911, but to no surprise the call didn't go through. That seemed another confirmation that I was somewhere underground, but I had no way of telling how deep. I realized then that in all likelihood nobody was coming to find me. The time on my phone read 11:48 a.m., meaning that I had been out cold for nearly 6 hours. I had most of the same clothes on, a pair of tan cargo shorts and my running shoes. The only thing missing was my crimson Alabama University hoodie. After looking around, I saw no sign of it. The air felt chilly and stagnant, and I shuddered as I rubbed the goosebumps on my exposed arms. Other than my thin layer of clothing, I also had my phone, a Leatherman multi-tool, keys, a pack of gum, and chapstick. Not exactly a wilderness survival expert's emergency pack. The corridor was unnervingly silent, devoid of any cave ambience. No howling wind leaking in cracks or distant drips of water. Just silence, intrusive and all-consuming. I started to walk, squinting to try and maximize my ocular reception under the minimal light of my cell phone. Each footstep I took, I did so with the utmost caution that I was capable of. It felt as though every sense in my body had been hypercharged from the onset of adrenaline and confusion. Before leaving the area, I had one last look back at the root system that had formerly imprisoned me. A thought struck me then as I observed it from further away. It almost looked like some sort of primitive cage. The tunnel stretched on for dozens of yards. Along the ground, I started finding tufts of what appeared to be dried grass and straw randomly strewn about. Beyond that, the tunnel came to a bend to the left and the trail of grass continued towards it. Once around the corner, my eyes were met with the sight of an open cavern. In the waning light of my flip phone, it was difficult to tell, but it was clearly of much greater volume than the previous tunnel. In front of me was a large pile of sticks and dried grass, similar to what I had seen earlier. Beyond that, the walls came to a sort of arch that briefly narrowed at 24 yards ahead of me, before seeming to expand out again in the next chamber. On top of the stone arch was a structure almost resembling a natural limestone bridge that seemed to connect two separate ledges some 30 feet above me. Above that, there appeared to be another open space, but once again my lack of proficient lighting made it difficult to tell. I tiptoed into the first section of the cave, keeping my head on a swivel. I reached the pile of debris and decided to dig within it to see if there was anything useful. After finding a long stick a moment later, an idea blossomed in my mind. I collected a few twigs and cut a long vertical strip off my belt with my pocket knife. I then removed both of my boots and socks. I fashioned the socks into a sort of pouch, stuffed them with grass and twigs, and then slipped it over the end of the stick. Once it seemed suitable enough, I took out my pack of gum and popped a piece in, while cutting the wrapper in a way to make it one long strand of foil. I bunched the foil into a cluster and popped the battery out of my cell phone. I placed the torch end in a pile of brush and then moved the foil cluster beneath it. Carefully, I took the two ends of the stripped foil and pressed one to each of the battery's terminals. In seconds, the strand began to smoke, and then burst into a small flame in the brush. The flame took to the dry grass quickly, and I watched the crimson hue dance along the pile. Thank you, Boy Scouts. Don't know what I would have done without that little trick. A second later, my makeshift torch is ignited. The flame grew stronger, penetrating further into the shadowy canopy around me. The panic in my mind diminished ever so slightly, as the orange glow of the torch painted an encouraging trail through the dark. As I turned to my left, my torch glinted off something upon the cave wall that caught my eye. I thought for sure that I had seen it wrong, but as I got closer, a series of distinct shapes came into view. On the porous gray rock about 4 feet off the ground were a series of cave paintings. They started low and spread for at least a dozen feet up the side of the wall. There were all sorts of things depicted. Most were little more than scrawny stick figure drawings of people, but there were a few animals as well. One scene that stood out from the others: 3 tall figures were drawn above a horizontal line, and 3 shorter ones were drawn down below it. The way the scene was centered on the wall made it seem significant, but I didn't understand why. The torch was burning quickly, so I maneuvered forward into the large open chamber beyond the archway. The fallen column above the arch appeared to bridge the gap between 2 rising ledges about 30 feet up. The way it was wedged made it look like it was done so intentionally, like somebody carved it out of the rock. The roof of the cavern beyond the structure appeared to curl upwards, and I wondered whether there was more to see. I stepped beyond it and felt my jaw nearly hit the floor as I got my answer. The room beyond the arch transitioned abruptly into an absolutely colossal chamber that appeared to extend upward for at least several hundred feet. Suddenly, it was bright enough to see without the torch, and I knew that meant light had to be filtering in from somewhere at the top. That realization provided hope, but also disbelief. How far underground was I? The chamber branched out at various points into countless winding passages, and pieces of rock ran overhead as makeshift bridges, looking like enormous veins in a massive stone organ. In the center was a massive center spire of rock that seemed to stretch all the way to the top. Many of the veins were connected to it, making it seem like a sort of central anchor. Something then suddenly moved a couple hundred feet up. I didn't see what it was, but I heard pebbles shuffle and plunge from above. They hit the ground with thunderous clacks, sounding like popcorn popping through a megaphone. Not knowing what had caused it, and not exactly yearning to find out, I ducked back underneath the arch. I waited there for a minute or so, but didn't hear any further noise. It was clear then that I wasn't alone down there. A metallic gleam shone then caught my attention from the brush pile in front of me. After looking closer, I recognized the distinct shape of a long barrel jutting out from underneath the pile. Part of me couldn't even believe what I was seeing, but as I got nearer and pulled it out, things just got even stranger. It was a musket, old school, flintlock kind, like one from the Manifest Destiny era. It was in poor condition and obviously wouldn't be suitable for self-defense except maybe as a vulgar club. But that wasn't what held my attention. If it was authentic and judging from the advanced rust on the hide it seemed like it could have been, then it had to be nearly 200 years old. After digging around for a few more moments, I quickly stumbled upon other treasures. An old leather belt, an Adidas sneaker, a broken machete, a knapsack, and finally, a bone. I dropped it as soon as I realized what it was that it was holding. It looked like a large thigh bone from an animal, probably a horse or a moose. An extremely worrying thought then entered my head, one which sprouted goosebumps along my arms. I glanced around at the environment, seeing the large gathered pile of sticks and other things. The way the bundles were arranged made it almost look like it was some kind of nest. Even then it seemed like a ridiculous notion. The pile was at least 30 feet in diameter. There's no creature on Earth that makes a nest that big, at least not that I know of. I couldn't calm my nerves after that though, and decided to just continue trying to move upwards and reach the top, and more importantly the light. Once past the pile, I found myself faced with a series of 3 branching tunnels. One of them appeared to slope downward, and after a moment of contemplation, I decided to just take the one on the far left that veered up. My torch began to dim, and I did everything I could to maintain the flame for as long as possible. My pockets soon began to run dry of grass, and the cave once again grew dark. After a couple more seconds, it was little more than smoldering ashes. Once again, I found myself alone in the dark. I grabbed the cell phone from my pocket and silently debated whether or not to go back for more fuel. An awful stench then accosted my nostrils like the malaise of a polluted rolling tide. It smelled like sewage and rotten eggs. The scent became so overwhelming that I felt my eyes begin to water and bile climb in my throat. Along with the noxious scent was an overwhelming sense of impending doom. Like my olfactory senses had triggered something deep, a primal fear hidden deep within my subconscious. I flipped open my phone and prayed my gut was wrong. The light from it barely made a difference, but it was enough to confirm my worst fear. I nearly dropped the phone as the outline of a decaying human hand became visible further down the corridor. Out of instinct, I took a step back and covered my mouth as I retched. Unfortunately, there was no real choice aside from proceeding. I popped in a fresh piece of gum and prayed that my eyes had deceived me as I stepped forward. It was even worse up close than even my imagination had built it up to be. Partially skeletonized hands and legs dangling with gangrene ribbons of flesh attached to a rotting corpse seated against the wall. Blackened intestines spewed from the gut like dead worms from some grotesque and moldy fruit. The head was missing entirely, and there was no indication as to where it had gone. My instincts were all but begging me to flee. I had every intention of doing so too until I saw a small knapsack on the ground beside the remains. On a hunch, it may provide something useful, and seeing as how the person clearly no longer had any use for it, I decided to take it. Once I lugged it onto my back, I said a few parting words for the nameless corpse and I moved on. As if it wasn't obvious before, that moment was when I truly realized the severity of my situation. Before that, I had almost assured myself that me waking up there was some kind of mistake or odd coincidence, but after seeing that, I abandoned that idea. Anxiety constricted my mind as I wondered whether I had been kidnapped by some perverse serial killer, chained up like a pig ready for slaughter, whenever he thought to entertain the notion. After putting sufficient distance between myself and the corpse, I knelt down and popped open the knapsack. Inside, I struck gold with a flashlight, a box of matches, a half-full water bottle, a pack of granola bars, and a few magazines. Those were all most welcome additions, but much to my chagrin, there was nothing to identify who the person was, or how they had gotten there. At least the flashlight still had some juice left in it. I flicked the switch and watched the flashlight sputter to life and blaze a trail through the passage. The tunnel was pretty unremarkable, appearing as just a long winding passage that led upward. Ever since the brush pile, I hadn't heard so much as a single decibel of sound. I never really realized how comfortable background white noise is until I was forced to go without it. After a couple more minutes of walking in utter silence, I reached another open chamber. Two more branching passages lay further ahead and seemed to stretch in nearly opposing directions. One branched out left and one right, with both seeming to lead upwards. As I approached the two passages and then noticed there was another directly above me on the ceiling, I looked up to see an extended chute, stretching for countless feet above me. Even the light of the flashlight was not enough to illuminate its entire length. Obviously, I had no means of traversing the vertical shaft, but the discovery made things even more mystifying. I elected to take the left-hand tunnel in hopes that it would lead to a higher level of the cavern. Before I could enter one of them, though, my footstep disrupted a pile of pebbles and sent them skittering outward across the ground. I froze, cursing myself for the noise and hoping nothing had been alerted by it. My mind was flooded with a torrent of catastrophic thoughts. It felt like breaking the silence within that place was somehow a graven sin in and of itself. Luckily for me, there was no other noises. The further I went, the less likely it seemed like the cave was a natural formation. The walls had almost patterned groove marks in them, as if something had methodically yet boorishly dug them out. A worrying thought manifested as I remembered the apparent nest from earlier. Maybe this was the den of some massive, unknown creature. For some reason I thought of Shelob, the giant spider from the Lord of the Rings, and obviously, that thought did not bring any comfort whatsoever. It seemed ridiculous, of course, but darkness and silence can play cruel tricks on a solitary mind. I hope that's all it was, and I did my best to suppress them and continue on. I dropped a piece of gum at the entrance of the next tunnel and continued walking. The idea was to use the glint of the shiny wrapper from the flashlight as a rudimentary map to help me find my way back to where I started if it came down to that. The more I went through, the more I doubted and hoped that I would not have to resort to that tactic. All sense of direction in that place was restricted to a bare minimum, as with even as short as I had traveled, I had no real sense of where I was in relation to where I had started. That tunnel seemed to bend and twist, like an enclosed spiral staircase on an endless incline. Finally, as I rounded yet another bend, I saw a dull light breaching the other end. I ventured forward, and once more the room elongated into that massive open chamber. There were some unusual items spread across the ground there as well. Splintered pieces of wood, along with a half-destroyed wooden chair. There was also a scattering of copper-colored coins across the ground, but I didn't recognize the denomination. However, one item stood out right away, an old rusted sword. I made my way over and knelt to inspect it on the ground. It looked like an old cavalry saber from the Civil War era. The hilt was rounded and encrusted with bronze, and the metal blade had clearly seen better years. It looked authentic, like the rifle from earlier, but of course that would lead to the quite elaborate conclusion that it had been there for a couple 100 years. I didn't think much about it in the moment though. I was just happy to have a weapon. "Hello?" A sudden voice froze me up like a breeze in the dead of winter. I killed the flashlight and ducked down. "Hello, anyone?" The ethereal voice sounded like a young girl calling from somewhere within the cave. Her vocal inflection quite clearly conveyed her terror, and I felt my heart quiver. The thought of a young girl alone in that place and terrified was haunting, and my instincts demanded that I try to help. I crept onward from the room and found myself once more entering the massive chamber from earlier, this time on a higher level. The cavern loomed large with an ancient empty tomb, and felt as though I were a single ant in an alien termite colony. Down below I heard the sounds of the girl whimpering, and I approached the ledge to try and spot her. The area beneath me was shrouded in shadow, and I saw nothing upon first glance. I debated upon turning my flashlight back on and shining down, but some part of me wouldn't comply with the thought. Like I knew it was the right thing to do, but fear had constricted me, and it wouldn't allow my hand to cooperate. I peeked over the edge, waiting in the darkness to try and see her. Her hushed sobs and frantic breathing met my ears, but I couldn't determine exactly where they were coming from. I kept quiet and continued listening, but something strange then happened. Her muffled cries changed to pitch and suddenly morphed into what I can only describe as a hooting, almost a manic animal screech. It was the weirdest thing that I had ever heard. Something then suddenly darted through the darkness down below me. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was quick. It disappeared in a split second, and I was forced to entertain a ridiculous notion. Maybe those sounds were not meant to signal distress. Maybe it was a lure. I can't exactly say why that unnerving thought entered my mind, but I picked up the pace a bit from then on. I crossed a fallen column to reach a higher elevation of ledges, sneaking glances down below to keep an eye out for whatever that thing was. Luckily, I managed to cross without incident, and kept maneuvering further into the convoluted cave system. Every path which seemed to incline upwards was the one that I took. At every tunnel I took, I left another piece of the wrapped gum at the entryway, and the pack continued to dwindle. Most corridors and rooms that I came to held very little of interest. Found a few empty piles of animal bones as well as various personal belongings scattered around. The items I found in no particular order were an old briefcase, a torn pair of jeans, a Solo winter boot, a Chicago Cubs baseball hat, and a lunchbox with spoiled contents. All of it was rather asinine, but then I came to that room. It was tucked away behind a large room that split into several other paths. By this point, I was at least several hundred feet above where I had started. The room itself was little more than a small separate grotto, but the items that I found inside were truly interesting. Most were articles of clothing, shirts, jackets, pants, hats and shoes of all sorts, numbering in the hundreds. I also saw a cane, a fishing pole, a baseball bat, a deflated football, and a small drink cooler. All the items in that room seemingly had a single thing in common. They all were either entirely or primarily red. It looked as though somebody had collected all of them over the years, and some of the articles and items looked decades old at the very least. I kept my new saber clutched tightly as I waded my way through the debris. I was then struck by the epiphany that my suspiciously absent hoodie had also been red. I looked around for it briefly, but I didn't find it. It got me thinking though, maybe red was the reason that I was there in the first place. Of course, I knew by then that I was not alone in the cave, and likely had been abducted to arrive there by someone or something. Maybe whatever had taken me didn't like red, or maybe they were attracted to it. Back outside, and I was once again met with another fallen column that led up to another higher ledge. This one was different though, incredibly steep and worn. There appeared to be no easy way up and no other real path to follow. I could see the light growing more luminous from above and knew the steep path was my only option to reach it. I stashed the sword on the back of my belt and began to climb. The rocks were slick and parts of them crumbled as I grabbed. I moved slowly, trying to stay both alive and quiet as much as possible. The road was tough, but I pushed on. I was nearing the halfway point when something stopped me dead in my tracks. Somewhere far above, I heard the sounds of pebbles tumbling down the cavern slopes. I looked up and saw a dusty cloud of residue blossom off the cavern wall. My eyes rapidly scanned the area above, but I didn't see anything that could have caused it. I was just about to continue when I spotted something strange. The dull light was filtering in from above, just barely illuminating the cavern. It was in that mystical twilight canopy that I saw it. On the far wall there was a small spot where the light appeared to shimmer in an odd fashion. I didn't understand what I was seeing at first, and I just stared at the odd image. It almost looked like something translucent was partially obscuring the light, like an impossible patch of water held together by some unknown force. I must have blinked or something, because one moment it was there and the next it was gone. A cold chill swept down my spine, and I decided the best thing that I could do was just keep moving. After taking a moment to level out my breaths, I continued onward, and thankfully, I reached the next ledge. Once I hauled myself up, I peered back down over the ledge and saw the chamber plunge downward into obscurity. By that point, I was nearing the top where the light was coming from. I just hoped that all the effort to get there would be worth it. The room beyond that ledge was yet another empty space, or at least I thought it was. Once inside, my flashlight gleamed off one of the walls and illuminated several patterns on the rock. The entire thing appeared haphazardly scrawled in some sort of black ink. It was only when I backed further away from the wall that I realized what it was. At first, I saw only squiggled lines, bloated ovals, and winding tubes, and then I saw the X carved into one side. A realization struck me then. It was a map. It was crudely made, but after further examination, I recognized that the X section was similar to the cavern that I was in. The pathways drawn also seemed to vaguely reflect the ones that I had taken to reach that point. My eyes grew wide as I made the undeniable discovery that if the map was in any way accurate, then I hadn't seen anything yet. The colossal chamber that I was currently in was only a tiny fraction of the entire piece. I counted 6 or 7 other sections that were at least double the size. The ends of the portrait seemed to fizzle away, as if whoever had drawn it had not yet completed the entire thing. That realization was staggering. Just how big is this place? I took a picture of the diagram with my cell phone and moved on. There were sudden noises and clangs far off in the distance, and I decided to move towards the light as quick as I could. According to the crude map, the way out of the labyrinth was near. If it was anywhere near true proportions, then I was already about 3/4 of the way there. I just had a little bit higher to go, but the worst was yet to come. I advanced onto yet another tunnel and began the arduous climb upward. I could see the light getting nearer, and I just hoped there was an actual means of getting out. Luckily, after rounding a few corners, I came face to face with just about the most beautiful thing that I had ever seen: the exit. In the ceiling, there were several partially transparent films of unknown material stretched over holes. The light was gently beaming in from above, and I knew it had to be the way out. The only question was how I was going to reach it, as the ceiling was well over 20 feet up. I made my approach into the open cavern and stared upwards at the patches in the rock above me. There were grooves and indentations in the side of the wall, and I thought that I may use them to climb up. It looked possible, but I didn't get the chance to try then. Out of the blue, I was suddenly struck in the chest by something. The blow was sudden, completely unexpected and sharp. I crumpled to my knees and held my ribs where the blow had struck, feeling blood begin to spill from several open wounds on my abdomen. I then heard the sudden pitter-patter of feet scampering by me. My eyes frantically darted around the room, but I did not see my assaulter anywhere, even though he had passed right by me. It didn't make any sense. A plume of dust was then disturbed above me. I looked up and saw something that I still cannot fully explain. It was the same odd shimmering anomaly of the light that I had seen before. It was closer this time, perched just above me on the ceiling. It was different than before though. There was a distinct shape to it, at least partially, like it looked different than the area around it. For anyone who's played the Halo franchise, just picture the translucent silhouette of an active camo upgrade, and that's basically how it looked. Something that was either partially cloaked or my eyes just weren't capable of fully perceiving it. It then moved and my heart dropped like a lead weight. There was definitely something up there and I had no idea what it was. Its outline looked vaguely humanoid, but it was hard to tell for certain. The saber in my hand quivered as I held it out towards the thing. The 3 separate wounds in my chest stung like hornet's venom, and I realized then that the pattern of them almost looked like something inflicted by claws. We just stared at one another for the longest time, before it suddenly made this sort of hooting noise. I then watched as it leapt away several feet and then disappeared into the shadows. Things fell silent once more and I seized my chance. Freedom was only a simple climb away, and with that in mind, I made a scramble for it. I began my climb up the wall. It was jagged and I felt rocks puncture into my hands, but I didn't care. I just had to get out. I was nearly the halfway point when something suddenly slammed into my back. The impact caused me to lose my grip and plummet about 10 feet back down to the cavern floor. I struck hard with my head bouncing off the solid dirt. The room wobbled around me and my head pulsed from the impact. Something then touched down ahead of me. I tried to stabilize my vision and clutched tightly onto the rusted saber as my only means of defense. As I rose to my feet though, I felt the thing slam into me. The 2 of us fell and rolled onto the dirt, wrestling and flailing about. Its claws were like razors and piranha-like teeth tore my flesh into ribbons. I fought back and struggled, somehow managing to force the thing off of me. I could barely even see what I was fighting, but as we broke apart and it tried to slink back into the shadows, I saw blood shining on its torso. I took a step forward and slashed horizontally with the saber. I felt the tip striking tear through its translucent hide. It seemed only like a minor wound, but the thing went ballistic. I can't even possibly describe the multi-layered cacophony that the thing produced. Voices and animals all blended into random blurbs of vocalized pain. It flailed about, wailing in a god-awful tone, as if suddenly driven to utter madness by what was honestly just a minor wound. Or perhaps stumble over the ledge and plummet into the chasm below. It struck with a hard squelch a second later and the silence returned. It didn't last though, and before I could even ask myself what had happened, I heard something down below. It began as a chorus of hoots, grunts, and indistinct noises. I heard pebbles scuttling about, and the aggravated voices grew in volume. There were more of them, many more of them. The only option that I had was the holes up above, and so once more I dashed towards the rock wall. I scrambled up as quick as I could as the horde of camouflaged things climbed from the abyss below. I heard them right beneath me as I reached the hole on the ceiling. There was some sort of thin film material covering the hole, but luckily I was able to push right through it. Daylight seared into my eyes as I plunged upward and burst out of the cave. The light accosted my retinas and it took a moment to adjust after being locked in darkness for so long. There were boulders around me and trees in the distance illuminated by a setting sun. Just as I was about to lunge outward, something grabbed a hold of my legs. I felt claws sink into my legs and tear into the flesh. I kicked and fought back with all the strength that I had left, refusing to be dragged back down into the cave without fighting. My fingernails cracked as I clung with all my might onto the ledge and kicked around wildly. By some miracle, I felt the thing's grip relinquish on my leg. I hobbled to my feet as the chorus of sounds wailed from below. My leg was bloodied, but the pain barely registered. Adrenaline had taken full control and I galloped into a run. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew that I had to get as far away from there as possible. I don't think I've ever ran for so long in my life. I heard them following behind me and I knew if I stopped for even a moment that I was dead. It was dark before I finally saw smoke wafting in the distance. With every last ounce of energy I possessed, I dashed towards it. The most beautiful sight that I had ever seen came into view then as a simple wooden cabin. I yelled out, hoping that somebody would hear my pleas and help me. Exhaustion and loss of blood struck me then, and I collapsed within a few dozen yards of the home. My vision began to fade, but I saw blurry outlines emerge from within the cabin. Things then went dark once again. The next thing I remember was waking up in the hospital greeted by the desperate expressions of family and friends. It was all so surreal. They wept tears of joy thanking God and others that I had returned. Part of me wondered then whether all the things I've related here today were just nightmares or vivid hallucinations of some kind of coma. But as soon as I saw the extent of my injuries, I knew that wasn't possible. I had apparently been gone for nearly 24 hours when I was found. My body was covered in deep cuts and lacerations. I had 3 broken ribs and a partially ruptured spleen. Many of my wounds had been stricken with infection, and it took weeks for me to heal. It was not a fun time, but at least I was alive. The doctors and police thought that my injuries were the result of an animal attack. They questioned me profusely, but I took the coward's way out. I didn't tell them much, only that I was out hiking and was suddenly attacked by something. Doesn't really explain the fact that I ended up at the cabin, which was nearly 15 miles away from the trail that I had started on, but that detail didn't come up. It felt wrong to lie to them, but I was paranoid that no one would believe me. I didn't even know if I could believe myself. Ever since that day, I've exhausted every possible rational explanation, but they always come up short. The memories are just too vivid. I still don't understand exactly how it all happened, but I've learned a few things. After I got out of the hospital, I started doing some research on all of this phenomenon to try and see whether anybody has been through something similar. The Appalachians are known for cases of mysterious disappearances. Dozens of cases have been reported over the years, with many of them remaining unsolved. I don't know whether they were all victimized by the same thing that I was, but I did notice one peculiar detail. Many of them were reported to have been wearing a red article of clothing when they were declared missing. In nature, red is the color of danger. Many animals like bulls have an innate fear or dislike of the color. It makes sense when you think about it too. Blood is red, fire too. Oftentimes, venomous snakes and insects will be partially or entirely red in color. Many poisonous mushrooms and berries also follow this pattern. I'm not positive, but I do believe red has something to do with this. As for what those things are, I really don't know. I've considered everything from aliens to ghosts and interdimensional creatures, but I don't think anybody knows for sure. There's a local legend about beings that supposedly live deep in the woods, hidden away from people. Indigenous folklore in the area mentions them extensively, but it sounds ridiculous. Fairies. Nothing like the cutesy Tinkerbell or Cosmo and Wanda. According to legend, they are subterranean creatures that stalk and drag their prey back down to their burrows. A lot of stories claim they live near rocks and boulders, something which reminded me of the location that I arrived in after first exiting the cave. I didn't really buy into this explanation until a friend of mine who was Native American mentioned one particular detail. Apparently, these beings are allergic to steel. That may explain what happened to the one that attacked me after I had nicked it with that old saber. Maybe the steel of the blade caused it to have a reaction. As for their apparent ability to cloak themselves, well, no one who I've told this account to honestly has been able to explain that. My same friend who told me about the fairies admit that he never really believed in them. They were just stories that his grandfather used to tell him as a kid. Both of us don't really know what to think now. Some people say that all myths and superstitions are rooted in something real. Real but benign stories passed from generation to generation by word of mouth is spiced up and exaggerated upon, thus eventually leading to the folklore that we tell each other around campfires. Maybe this story, the myth, doesn't need to be exaggerated. Maybe the reason that the world scoffs at these stories is because the truth is very good at hiding. I know how all of this sounds, trust me. Every skeptical thought that has passed through your mind while reading this is probably something that I myself have considered at one point or another. If you choose to write this off as no more than fiction, then that is your decision. I've saved this for the end because I know there are those who skim through posts to see the conclusions. I want as many people to see this message as possible. It's the only thing that really matters. Please, don't wear red in the Appalachian woods or any other woods for that matter. You may not believe in or ever see the things that I have, and honestly, I hope you never do. But just remember, when you're out on a trail in the middle of the woods, they will see you. Don't provoke them, because even if you survive, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing a truth that no one will ever fully believe, just like me. This is an ad by BetterHelp. We've all been there, venting to a coworker during your lunch break. They might be great for small talk, but when it comes to serious things like stress, relationships, or mental health, they're not exactly trained to guide us through it. That's where BetterHelp comes in. Connect with a licensed therapist online and get the support that's actually built for you. BetterHelp therapists work according to a strict code of conduct and are fully licensed in the US. With over 30,000 therapists, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served over 5 million people globally. It's convenient too. You can join a session with a therapist at the click of a button, helping you fit therapy into your busy lifestyle. Plus, you can switch therapists at any time. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Find the one with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/MrCreeps. That's better, HELP.com/MrCreeps. I became a teacher because I wanted to save the world, one kid at a time. I know it sounds naive, but I believed it was possible because it happened to me. I grew up in a rough inner-city neighborhood with parents who were barely around. It was my teacher, Mr. Maysfield, who listened when I needed to talk, helped me get a scholarship to college, and even intervened on my behalf when I got in trouble with the law. He had been there for me, and now I wanted to be there for someone else. As soon as I got my teaching degree, I applied for a program that matched educators with schools in need. And during the tense months I spent waiting for a placement, I imagined that I would be working in a school like the one that I had graduated from. I figured my students would be like me, city kids with city problems, and a lifestyle that I was familiar with. When my letter finally arrived, I discovered that I had been assigned to a tiny Appalachian town called Deer Chase. Its population was less than 300, and according to the organization, most of my students would be bussed in from nearby hollers that were even more remote. I had never lived anywhere without public transportation, without 24-hour shops, without background noise and light pollution. I had received a letter along with my posting, one in which my future principal explained just how isolated Deer Chase really was. It was an hour to the nearest gas station, and even further to the nearest grocery store. In winter, snow piled up on the narrow holler roads, making them impassable for weeks at a time. The creeks usually flooded in the spring, and if I went into the woods during the summer, I would need to be on lookout for sinkholes and rattlesnakes. The only piece of good news was that the school had a house for visiting teachers, so at least I would be living rent-free. The more that I read about Deer Chase, the less I liked it, but I had made a commitment. I wasn't going to back out now just because the location wasn't to my liking. Besides, I needed the work badly, and I had heard rumors that the organization blacklisted any teacher who turned down a posting. As I packed for the 14-hour drive to Deer Chase, I told myself to look on the bright side. Maybe this was my chance for one last big adventure after college. For all I knew, I might be about to discover that I loved life in the country. My second-hand hatchback had over 250,000 miles on it, and I was more than a little worried that it wasn't going to survive the journey. In order to give my car a break, I decided to spend the night at a rest area halfway to my destination. I couldn't get over how exposed the place was. Those glaring overhead lights, the nearly empty parking lot, the rumbling trucks and shadowy figures going to and from the bathrooms. At one point I thought for sure that I heard something scraping against the door lock, but by the time that I woke up and looked around, the source of the sound was gone. Had someone been trying to get inside my car? I gave up on sleep and began the second half of my journey while in the dark. Dawn was breaking by the time that I took the highway exit toward Deer Chase. Not that the town appeared on any signs. I was grateful that I had written the directions down too. My GPS service was spotty on the mountain roads, and after a while, all those gloomy forest-covered hills started to look the same. Maybe it was just the lack of sleep, but eventually I did end up getting a little bit lost. I pulled into a gas station, the kind that also sold fishing bait and groceries, where I hoped that I could get a little help. A dusty bell jingled above the door as I walked inside. The 3 old men at the counter might have been customers, employees, or lifelong friends. It was impossible to say which. They stopped talking and observed me carefully. I cleared my throat and asked if any of them knew the way to Blank Hollow Road. The 3 men traded glances. Finally, one scratched his stubbly white beard and sighed. You missed it a couple miles back. That road goes right down into the valley. The sign's overgrown and the turn really sneaks up on ya. He warned me. You headed down there for fishing? The large bald man in overalls beside him wanted to know. I shook my head. I had been about to tell the trio exactly who I was and what I was doing there, but the way that they were questioning me had put me on guard. The less that these 3 knew, I figured, the better. I had just thanked them and turned to go when the 3rd man shouted something after me. Well, just don't stay down there too long. You don't want to come back with the deer chase stare. He chuckled. It was apparently a joke, but the other 2 weren't laughing. The large bald man leaned in close and whispered something. It seemed like he was telling him off. You take care now, he warned me, and make sure to be out of there before dark. Part of me wanted to ask what he meant. Another part suspected that the 3 of them were just messing with me. My shiny black shoes and polo shirt made it clear that I was an outsider. And it wasn't a stretch to the imagination that all their talk about the deer chase stare and getting out of there before dark was a prank invented by some bored old man. 10 minutes later, I was turning down Blank Hollow Road, even though I had nearly missed it for a second time. Hidden in the shadow of so many large trees, the steep downhill route seemed more like a cave than a road. Small, slow-flowing streams and narrow game trails crossed it at regular intervals. At times, I caught a glimpse of a rickety tobacco barn or a junk-cluttered trailer through the trees, but even those looked abandoned. 20 minutes later, the valley finally opened up ahead of me, and I could finally see the town of Deer Chase. It was a cluster of weather-beaten brick buildings, a church, a general store, a mechanic's garage, and the school where I would be teaching at. Apart from the rusty bridge that crossed the creek into few houses, there didn't seem to be anything else in town. I drove through slowly, checking addresses in search of the place that the organization had rented for me. I was surprised and a little unnerved to find that the house was just a few doors down from the school. I knew how vindictive some students could be, and I would have preferred a little more separation between my work life and my private life. A slim, middle-aged man in a wicker hat sat on the porch across the street, smoking his pipe and watching my progress. So far, he was the only other person that I had seen in Deer Chase. I smiled and pulled up to the address that I had been given in the letter. The house was small and on the older side, but the wide windows and fresh white paint gave it an open and airy feel. Just as I had been promised, the key was beneath the welcome mat. As I stooped down to retrieve it, I felt a presence behind me. The air suddenly smelled like cologne, hayseed, and tobacco. "You're the new blood, huh?" a hoarse voice announced. I turned. The middle-aged man from the house across the street was holding out his hand to me. "Don Fry, principal at Deerfield High. I'm the one who sent you that letter." I shook it. After so many hours in the car, my clothes were wrinkled and my shirt was half untucked, and my hair was a sweaty mess. It wasn't exactly the first impression that I wanted to make, but Don Fry didn't seem to mind. "Long drive, huh?" was his only comment. Principal Fry immediately launched into a speech that he had obviously given before, one in which he explained that the school owned this property, that the custodian would take care of yard work and maintenance, but I was responsible for keeping the inside neat and tidy. and that it was important to keep the trash cans sealed to discourage wildlife from approaching the house. Until he mentioned it, I hadn't really fixated on how the woods seemed to loom over my new home. Just about every residence in Deer Chase butted up against the forest-covered hills, with barely a tiny patch of grass to separate them from all those gnarled and grasping branches. I thought of bears, vultures, and rabid raccoons and then shuddered. Principal Fry chuckled. "You're from the city, right? For some reason, almost all the kids they send to us are from the city. You'll learn to like it out here, though. Most everybody who comes out here renews their contract at least once or twice. But I'm sure you've already heard all that from Michelle." According to the organization, I should have received a video call in which my predecessor, Michelle Hardesty, told me about her experience in Deer Chase and offered some helpful tips and suggestions for teaching there. All that I had received so far, however, was a paragraph-long email. I had written Michelle back to schedule a call, but so far I had heard nothing. I decided not to mention it to Principal Fry. I didn't want to get anybody in trouble, and besides, I was exhausted from the 2-day drive to Deer Chase. "I'm right across the way," Principal Fry reminded me, "so don't be a stranger, you hear?" And with that, he clapped me on the back and laughed. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I still felt eyes on me from inside the dark windows of these surrounding houses while I unpacked. I was being paranoid, I told myself. I needed to relax and give Deer Chase a chance. At dusk, there was a knock at the front door. I peered through the people, but I couldn't see anyone, only a large brown bag with a note stapled to it. The tension of being in an unfamiliar place made my mind race with nasty possibilities. What might be inside? Some stranger's crap, a dead animal, a severed human head, or maybe something even worse than that. I bit my lip and opened the door. "Welcome to your new home," read the note. Signed, "Your Neighbors." The bag contained a week's worth of groceries, several home-cooked meals, and a blackberry pie. Everything was delicious. It was enough to make me forget about the strange sounds of nighttime in the country, and I fell asleep almost as soon as I climbed into bed. The weeks before school started passed by in a blur. There may not have been many people in Deer Chase, but they all seemed to want to meet me at once. Cecil, the mechanic, came by to offer me a discount on an oil change. Reverend Witt from Deer Chase Baptist Church wanted to know if I had been baptized. I was constantly bombarded with advice and gossip or invitations to dinner, and I still hadn't even prepared my first lesson. Under the circumstances, I guess it's no surprise that I overlooked some of the more unusual aspects of life in Deer Chase, like how so many of the houses, including mine, seemed to have a path into the woods in their backyards, or the total absence of teenagers on the streets. I knew kids didn't spend as much time outside as they used to, and that Deer Chase had a tiny youth population, but I had still somehow expected to see a few of my soon-to-be students tossing a ball into the rusty hoop in front of the church, or sneaking puffs from a cigarette on the weathered wood steps of the general store. Tom Minton's Goods and Sundry read the rusty tin sign on the general store's roof, and it was the first place that I went to once these supplies from the gift bag had begun to run out. The shelves were stocked with everything from cans of beans to zip ties and romance novels. All of it was dusty and overpriced. I expected to find a bespectacled old man behind the counter. Instead, I discovered that the owner was a freckly redhead who looked to be around my age. Tom Minton was my grandfather, she shrugged, when I had asked her about the sign. Her name was Ruth Minton, and she was one of the only people who hadn't come by to say hello along with the rest of the casserole parade. She was reserved and tight-lipped when compared to the rest of them. She gave one-word answers to my questions and usually hurried into the back of the store to avoid any attempt that I made at conversation. At first, I thought she didn't want to give me the wrong idea, considering that we were both young and single. But by the end of August, I had begun to suspect something darker was going on. Ruth went straight from the store to home and never spoke to anyone in town if she could help it. It was almost like she was scared of them, although I couldn't see why. The locals had been nothing but kind to me since I had arrived. The only thing that bothered me were the noises that I sometimes heard at night. Principal Fry had warned me about animals trying to get into the trash, so I figured that was all that it was, at first. Maybe it was just city boy skittishness, but whatever was out there sounded a lot bigger than some raccoon. It called to mind unsettlingly the little path that it began in my backyard, the one that I still hadn't gotten around to fully exploring. If nobody was using it, it should have been a lot more overgrown, right? Work pushed those disquieting thoughts right out of my mind. During the week before school, I met my future coworkers and got my first look inside Deer Chase High School. Like the house that I was staying in, its worn hallways and yellowed light fixtures were old but well kept. Most of my fellow teachers were locals who had moved back to the area after college. I didn't have much to add to their conversations about hunting or engine repair, but they did their best to include me anyway. Everything was going fine, until September 1st. The arrival of those rumbling yellow school buses completely transformed Deer Chase High. Suddenly students were everywhere, yelling, goofing around, and greeting each other after the long summer vacation. I felt a little guilty. In the back of my mind, I had been expecting horror movie stereotypes. A bunch of creepy blonde kids who were all in some religious cult, or a classroom full of ignorant, inbred hicks. But instead I found that teens in Deer Chase were just like kids the whole world over. They even listened to some of the same music as my students back in the city. Most of them already knew who I was, and a few of the older students even stopped to greet me and asked what I thought of their town so far. After the first 15 minutes of class, I was brimming with confidence. This was going to be easier than I thought. I'll never forget what happened next. We were doing an icebreaker activity. The students were all up out of their seats, milling around the room. Derek, Reverend Witt's 17-year-old son, had just told a joke that had the whole class laughing, even me. And then suddenly, everyone froze. Most had stopped in uncomfortable positions with hands thrown up in the air or leaning cross-legged on someone else's desk. A few had even been caught mid-clap. If it was some bizarre prank, however, it shouldn't have worked so seamlessly. At least one or two of the students should have giggled or wobbled in their awkward stances, but nobody did. I waved a hand in front of Derek's wide-eyed grinning face. He didn't even blink. Some of their eyes were beginning to water. Saliva dribbled down from their open mouths, and the unnatural poses were causing some students' muscles to pulse beneath their skin like twitching worms. I was starting to get worried. I clapped, shouted, warned them to knock it off, all to no avail. I picked up the phone and dialed the principal's office. When I still hadn't gotten an answer after 10 rings, I stuck my head out into the hallway. The whole building, it seemed, had gone silent. Seconds ticked by. And then without warning, life resumed. Hands clapped together, conversations went on as though they had never been interrupted at all. Principal Fry called back to ask what was wrong. Nothing, I said, but my eyes were fixed on the clock. 6 whole minutes had passed, but apparently I was the only one who noticed it. A hand on my shoulder made me jump. "You okay, Mr. B?" Derek asked. "You look a little wound up." This time, he wasn't smiling. "First day jitters, I guess," I teased. "You guys are just too much for me." Derek went back to the activity, apparently satisfied, but he whispered something to Susie, the tall, ponytailed girl who sat beside him. When the bell rang to switch classes, both of them looked over their shoulders at me as they left. I couldn't read the expression on their faces. It seemed almost like suspicion or fear. If the whole thing had been just a joke, then why did the two of them seem to be taking it so seriously? The remainder of my classes went fine, or would have, if I hadn't been so shaken up. Fortunately, most of the students at Deer Chase High were just as friendly and welcoming as their parents. Even though I was distracted and unfocused, nobody gave me any real trouble. So why couldn't I escape the feeling that the whole school was watching me, waiting to see how I would react to the morning's events? It got worse as the day went on, and by last period, I was scared of my own shadow. I jumped in my chair when Principal Fry came by to ask me how my first day had gone. As much as I had longed to mention those missing 6 minutes, I didn't want to give the impression that the kids were already messing with me. It went great, I told him, and went back to preparing the following day's lesson. In my dreams that night, I was back in the classroom, trapped with those statues still teenagers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The ticking of the clock felt as loud as a drumbeat. This time, however, something was different. The students inched a little closer each time I blinked. The expressions on their faces, too, began to change. Instead of being locked in laughter, they twisted into something animalistic and hateful. Their hands lifted, as though they wanted to fling me to the floor and eat me alive. I tugged at the door handle, but it refused to open. The lights flickered, and then I woke up with a start. I lay in bed, watching the ceiling fan stir the muggy summer air and trying to sleep. I heard more of those noises outside. This time, there could be no doubt about it. What I was hearing were footsteps, several sets of them. I rushed to the kitchen to turn on the backyard floodlights, but they didn't work. No matter how hard I squinted, all I could see through the windows was the pitch blackness of a moonless country night. I had problems sleeping for the next 2 weeks. Because I had prepared everything well and these students were so easygoing, I was able to get through each day, but it was clear that I couldn't keep this up. The next Friday afternoon, I packed up my things right after last period and headed home for a well-deserved nap. Halfway across the street, however, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. Where had all the shouts and conversation gone? The only noise left was the rumbling of school bus engines and the lonely bounce of an abandoned basketball. It was happening again. All of the teenagers in Deer Chase had suddenly frozen in place. I looked desperately around for another adult presence, if only to confirm that I wasn't crazy, and I locked eyes with the nearest bus driver. To my surprise, she didn't look bothered at all by the phenomenon. She just drummed her long crimson nails on the steering wheel impatiently, waiting for it to pass. I stuck my head through the open bus door and asked what was wrong. "Wrong?" she snorted. "I don't know what you're talking about." I couldn't believe it. Weaving through the crowd of eerily unmoving students, I made my way to Principal Fry's office. If anybody could explain this, it was him. The student sprang back to life, and just as I was approaching his door, a football player shoulder-checked me and apologized. He seemed genuinely confused about how we had crashed into each other. They don't know, I realized. None of them are aware of what's happening to them. Or maybe not none of them. Principal Fry's door swung open just as I was arriving, and 2 students walked out. Derek Witt and Susie, the girl with the ponytail from my first period class. From the looks on all 3 of their faces, they had just been talking about me. "Oh, Derek here was just telling me how great your first lesson was," Principal Fry told me. "And he's not an easy young man to impress." I hadn't overheard much of their conversation, but it was enough to chill my blood. I had caught the words, "Sure he noticed," and "happening more often." I stammered a thank you to Derek, but decided against mentioning the weird trance that these students had just gone into. Whatever was happening here, Principal Fry was already aware of it, maybe even a part of it. I went home, wrote yet another email to my predecessor Michelle, and collapsed into bed. The sun was setting when I woke up. There was still time, I realized, to ask one other person about the strangeness that I had witnessed. Ruth Minton at the general store. She was locking up when I approached, and my unexpected presence made her jump. "What do you want?" she inquired irritably. I asked if she had known Michelle. "Yeah, I did," was all Ruth said before stuffing her keys in her jacket pocket and stomping down the stairs. "Why did she leave?" I insisted. "I can't get her to call me or have a real conversation, no matter how hard I try." Ruth glared at me as though that should have told me everything that I needed to know. "Wait," I shouted after her, but she was already gone, scurrying toward her beat-up truck like a hunted deer. As I walked back home, I caught a glimpse of a pipe smoldering in the gloom of the porch across the street. Principal Fry was watching us. On my last grocery run, I had picked up a light bulb for the backyard floodlight, but it still wasn't working. Cecil, the custodian, had been evasive about what the problem might be. It made me wonder whether maybe my lights had been tampered with on purpose. I found myself pacing from room to room, wondering what the hell these people were hiding. Was this what those old men at the gas station had meant when they had talked about the deer chase stare? Last time, the sound of footsteps at night had coincided with the student's trance. If the pattern held, whoever had been passing through my backyard would be back tonight. There was a chance that I might be able to catch them in the act, if I was lucky. Giving up on sleep, I crept out the back screen door and squatted in the shadow of a magnolia tree near the path. The moon overhead was almost full, and I was confident that I would be able to see the trespasser without being seen myself. The only problem was the bugs. I had barely gotten into position when I felt something crawling down my cheek. I didn't see what it was before I swatted it away, but it had felt almost hand-sized. Next came the mosquitoes. The longer I sat there, the more of them closed in, as though they were having their last big feast before fall arrived. I was about to give up and go inside when I spotted 5 dark shapes tiptoeing along the side of the house. One of them was Susie. She paused to check inside my bedroom window. I shivered, suddenly glad that I had left the bed messy enough so that it appeared somebody was sleeping there. She gave the other 4 a thumbs-up sign, and the group made straight for the path. I recognized all of them as Deer Chase high school students. "Go inside and call the police," screamed the sensible side of my brain. "Well, then tell them what?" replied the more daring half. "The only way you'll ever get to the bottom of this is if you follow them yourself." And that's exactly what I did. I had never imagined that my first teaching job would involve missing time or creeping through the woods by moonlight. And yet here I was, getting further away from safety with every step. I thought of all the stories that I had heard of people who had gotten lost for weeks or died of exposure in small, well-traveled parks just because they had wandered a short distance off of the trail. And Deer Chase was a lot more remote than any of those places. What if I got turned around in the dark? The students up ahead at least seemed confident that they knew the way. The branches cast inky black shadows on the pale dirt trail. The 5 teenagers walked quickly and in total silence. Wherever they were going, they were in a hurry to get there. They didn't look back once, not even after a twig snapped beneath my heel. The path wound up to a rocky ridge that offered a panoramic view of the whole valley, and then it descended steeply into a narrow gully. It joined up with other trails along the way. Some of them even had handholds worn into the stone, as though they had been used for generations. All of the paths led downward. The humid air was full of frog croaks and the whir of insects. The ground beneath my feet slowly transformed into slick muck. The vegetation was thicker down here, with more grasping limbs and gnarled roots to trip over, and the mosquitoes were worse than ever. What the hell could a group of teenagers want with a place like this? Up ahead, the foliage finally opened up, revealing a slime-covered pond with a dead tree at its edge. Fireflies, moss, and other bugs that I couldn't identify fluttered above the water. The group made directly for the tree, and then halted at the sound of something crashing through the undergrowth. Something huge. The largest stag that I had ever seen was barreling towards the 5 teens, swinging its crown of antlers from side to side like a deadly pendulum. Its mouth frothed, its eyes were wide and rolling. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but the stag changed directions, making for the tree instead. It scraped its body against the bark for several minutes, and then charged off as quickly as it had come. The group of teens exchanged a glance, but they didn't seem frightened or even surprised. Well, except for one of them. Beside Susie stood a shorter girl who I thought I recognized. She was a freshman and Susie's sister. She clung to her older sibling's hand as though she might fall off the earth if she let go. I inched nearer. "You ready, Katie?" Susie whispered. "As I'll ever be," Katie replied. Her braces flashed in the moonlight as she gave the group a nervous little smile. "Go on," a broad-shouldered boy from the Deer Chase High School football team told her. "You know what to do, it's not scary." The fear on Katie's face said otherwise. With Susie and the others forming a sort of honor guard around her, she approached the dead tree. There was no cover between the edge of the woods and the murky shore of the pond, but I was going to have to get even closer if I wanted to see what they were up to. I took a deep breath and tiptoed out into the moonlight. All it would take now was one of them turning around and I was totally exposed. I didn't breathe again until I was hidden by the reeds at the pond's edge. Katie ran her fingers across the gnarled wood. She seemed to be trying to catch something smaller than a dime that emitted a faint greenish light. There were dozens of them scurrying across the tree. To me, they looked a lot like glow-in-the-dark ticks. Katie trapped one gently between her fingers and inspected it in the moonlight. "At the back of the neck's the best place," Susie explained to her little sister. Katie, still hesitant, followed her advice. Seconds later, Katie's face contorted with pain and then she giggled. "You see?" Susie squeezed her shoulder. "Not any worse than ripping a band-aid off. It might take a minute or two for it to kick in, though." The others were already combing the tree for their own brightly colored bugs. The football player cupped one gently between his hands before holding it against his wrist. Another boy passed one to Susie, who accepted gratefully. The 5 of them stood at the edge of the moonlit pond. Their unmoving black silhouettes looked like some sort of bizarre, surrealist sculpture. Finally, the football player's shoulders began to shake. He clapped his hands together, threw his head back, and laughed. He took off running through the woods, careless of any path, almost like the stag that we had seen a few minutes before. The others went after him, dancing, twirling, and gibbering like they had lost their minds. Once I was sure that they were gone, I walked up to the dead tree myself. There were still several of those glowing tick-like insects skittering around, but I wasn't planning to pick one up myself, not without gloves anyway. This, I thought, must be the truth behind the so-called deer chase stare. The kids in town were all getting high on the venom of these weird little bugs. Their trances, or whatever they were just a side effect. I already had a plan in mind. I would catch a few of the insects in a jar and take them to a buddy of mine at the State University, a guy who was getting his PhD in entomology. Even if he wasn't able to explain what was happening to the teenagers in Deer Chase, he would surely know somebody who could. Little by little, life and sound returned to the pond. Frogs croaked, cicadas whirred, and a fat possum blinked down at me from a limb overhead. It would have been a picturesque, late-night scene if it wasn't for the secret that I now knew. I looked back up the path with a sinking feeling, wishing that I had turned around from time to time to see what the trail looked like from the other direction. Apart from a few tense moments when the path was hidden by rotting leaves or scrambled over stone, however, I was able to follow it back with no problems. Just how often did the local teenagers come down to this place and others like it? I thought back to what Derek had said in Principal Fry's office about those freakish, frozen-in-time moments. It's happening more often. What if the trances weren't a side effect after all? What if they were a withdrawal symptom? The thought of generation after generation creeping down here to take their first hit, only to become dependent on some insect's venom. It made my skin crawl just thinking about it. One thing was for sure, I couldn't trust Principal Fry or any of the other local authorities with what I had discovered. I had to get this information to somebody far away from Deer Chase. When I finally got back, the digital clock in the kitchen read 3:03 a.m. The house, at least, was undisturbed, and the lights were out in the homes across the street. Nobody had noticed my absence, or at least I hope not. I showered away the grime of the woods off of my skin and threw myself into bed, exhausted. The next Monday, I kept an eye out for the group that I had seen in the woods. I had expected to find them gaunt and hollow-eyed, their bodies still reeling from that insane dance through the forest. But apart from a few scratches, all 5 looked happy and healthy. They looked better, in fact, than any teenagers that I had ever seen. When I had first started teaching in Deer Chase, the cheerful, easygoing attitude of the students had been a relief. But now it suddenly seemed sinister. After work, I went home and made a shopping list, one that included glass jars and thick rubber gloves. I was just about to head out the door when I spotted a broad-brimmed straw hat bobbing up and down on the other side of the living room window. Principal Fry. What was he doing back on my porch? Fully aware that there was no way to get to my car without being seen, I stepped outside and greeted him. The school principal was seated in my front porch rocker, refilling his pipe and looking out over the town like he owned the place, and maybe in a certain sense he did. Been meaning to tell you, he smiled apologetically. Your front tires are starting to look a little bit low. I glanced over his shoulder at my hatchback. The tires weren't just low, they were flat. Don't worry. Principal Fry reassured me when he saw the look of horror on my face. I already talked to Cecil. He should have some replacements for you in a week or 2 tops. He paused to light his pipe and then went on. The school district will pick up the bill. See, we know how hard it must be for you. Moving to a place like this where you might run into all sorts of unexpected things. But you'll also find that around here we take care of our own, no matter what. I wasn't sure whether it was a veiled threat or whether Principal Fry was just being neighborly, but I was pretty confident that I hadn't run over anything sharp recently. The sabotage was probably deliberate, which meant that I would have to find another way to get the proof of what I found out of Deer Chase. My gaze drifted to the big rusty tin sign in the middle of town, the one that read, Tom Minton's Goods and Sundry. I told Principal Fry that we'd talk more later, but right now I needed to pick something up at the general store. I've got to talk to you, I shouted to Ruth before she could run into the back of the store like usual. She stood up from the shelves that she was stocking and dusted off her hands on her jeans. It seemed like she already knew what was coming. I was going to take a chance. If I was wrong, it might be the last thing that I ever did. You're different from everybody else in Deer Chase, I said, and I think I know why. Ruth froze. For an awful second, I was afraid that it was the Deer Chase stare all over again. But then I realized how long she must have been waiting for someone to say those words. How long she must have been waiting to share her story with somebody that she could trust. "My grandfather Tom was a God-fearing man," Ruth stammered. "Not like that hypocrite Reverend Witt and his son Derek. Tom Minton made our whole family promise that we wouldn't go into the woods at night along with the rest of them, and as you can imagine, that didn't make us very popular. My ma and sisters all left town but not me. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction. After what happened to Michelle, though..." I glanced nervously toward the door. Cecil, the mechanic, and his son, the football player who I had seen in the woods, were standing in front of the garage across the street. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but then again, maybe not. I asked Ruth what she meant about Michelle. She admitted that she didn't have any evidence, only suspicions, and the confidence that Michelle had been her friend. She never would have just left without telling her. And yet one day toward the end of the past school year, my predecessor had just vanished. Her car was gone and the house was empty, and all of its lights had been turned off. Ruth had gone so far as to message the social media accounts of Michelle's parents asking for news about their daughter. They said that they heard from her about once a week and that she had taken another remote teaching job on the other side of the country. Everybody's saying they've heard from her, but it's all through email. No one's seen Michelle or heard her voice in months. And those emails, they don't sound like the bubbly West Coast gal that I used to know. They sound like someone pretending to be her. And you know the worst part? Right before she disappeared, Michelle was doing just what you're doing now, standing here asking for a ride out of town. Ruth drew in a long, ragged breath. "Go pack. I'll pick you up in 15 minutes. I checked outside again. Cecil and his son were gone. I forced myself to walk rather than run back to the house. No one was on the streets of Deer Chase, but that didn't mean that no one was watching. It was a hot, humid afternoon, and by the time that I reached the porch, I was thinking more about a glass of cold water and what I was planning to stuff into my suitcase than the dangers of Deer Chase. I stepped inside, locked the door behind me, and was just turning toward the kitchen when I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cecil and his son. I barely had time to think of the name before the pair slammed me against the floor. A muscly knee pressed into my spine and my arms were pinned. "This house is property of the school," Principal Fry said, "and so of course I have a spare key." He stood in the shadows of the room and he wasn't alone. Susie and his sister Katie were at his side. Susie held a small glass jar that contained a few scurrying insects that I recognized. Grunting from the pain, I asked him how he had known. "Your shoes," Principal Fry explained. "There aren't many places around here where you'll find that sort of thick black mud, and all of them are home to our little friends here." Susie approached with the jar. Her sister carefully unscrewed it. Principal Fry snapped on one of his wife's gardening gloves and reached inside. "One of these little fellas could bite me right now and I wouldn't get much more than a rash, some funny dreams, and a day or two fever. I'm too old, you see. A young person like you, on the other hand, the effects get weaker after the age of 20 or so, but I think that you're still young enough to appreciate what they can do." I thrashed and kicked, but Cecil and his son were both twice my size. I couldn't see what was happening, but I could sense the tiny legs creeping across the back of my neck. Just as I was praying that it wouldn't bite, I felt a twinge of pain just above my right shoulder. "Not any worse than ripping off a Band-Aid," Susie had said, and it was true. Moments later, the area around the bite began to feel hot. My stomach rolled as though I had just taken a plunge on a roller coaster. And then that tiny bug's venom finally took effect. My mentor, Mr. Maysfield, had kept me away from hard drugs, but he couldn't change the neighborhood that I grew up in. I had tried weed, coke, and oxy. This stuff was better than all three. It was better than sex, better than hearing a judge say the words "not guilty," better than the happiest moment of my life. Space became sound and sound became color, and the whole thing blended into a glorious symphony that felt like it would never end. When I came back to my senses, the sun had set and the temperature was dropping. I was somewhere on the two-line road outside of Deer Chase. My legs ached from all the running or maybe the dancing that I had been doing during the past several hours. A truck rumbled up behind me. It might have even been there all along. Reverend Witt was driving, Derek was in the back seat, and Principal Fry was riding shotgun. He stuck his head out the window. "And just think," he chuckled, "that's not even a tenth of what you would have felt like if you were 16. As you probably noticed, Principal Fry went on, there aren't many good jobs around here. There's no industry, no culture, no tourist attractions. Our little tradition is the one thing that we've got going for us, and we'll defend it to the death if need be." I wiped drool from my mouth with the back of my hand. I stared hungrily at the pickup. I knew that I should have been screaming about how wrong all of this was, but all I could think of was how badly I wanted more of it. Reverend Witt and Principal Fry winked at each other and exchanged a knowing glance. "Oh, don't worry, son," the Reverend smiled, holding up Susie's, a little glass jar. "All things come in God's good time." On the drive back to the house, Principal Fry explained his terms. For the duration of my contract, I was forbidden from leaving Deer Chase without being accompanied by either Reverend Witt, Cecil, or himself. The same went for calls and messages exchanged with anybody outside of town. In return, I would receive a dose of chase tick venom as often as I could safely receive it. The seasons changed. I grew accustomed to how my students would sometimes stop mid-step or mid-sentence, to how their eyes would glaze over as they glared intently at something I couldn't see. Later, I began to notice that I was missing time myself. I took it in stride, knowing that in Deer Chase it was all normal. I knew that the community would look out for me, and so they did. A for sale sign eventually popped up in the dusty window of Tom Minton's Goods and Sundry. Everyone told me that Ruth had finally given up and moved away. Eventually, I even managed to convince myself that it was true. I renewed my contract and then renewed it again. By the end of my third year, I was 25 and the chase tick venom barely did anything for me anymore, just as Principal Fry had said. For older adults, all it offered was a rash of fever and some intense dreams during the following night. So it was time to move on. After I had said my goodbyes to my friends in Deer Chase, I took Principal Fry's hand, silently reaffirming my promise to never mention the town's strange secret to anyone. I continued my career as a teacher, and my performance reviews were glowing, although they did mention how I seemed to space out from time to time. Things might have gone on like that forever, if it wasn't for the severe flooding in the Deer Chase area last spring. The rising water left behind the remains of a pickup truck that had been dumped into the creek, as well as the corpse of a young woman with her hands cuffed to its steering wheel, Ruth Minton. The discovery prompted state police to dredge the rest of the creek, where Michelle Hardesty was finally found. Her body had been weighed down by chains and mummified with electrical tape. Most disturbing of all, her parents had received an email from her just a few days before. Police had traced its transmission to a fast food joint at the same exit that I had taken to reach Deer Chase, one that offered free Wi-Fi. I wasn't sure what stung more, the knowledge that the people of Deer Chase had hidden the truth from me, or the knowledge that I had been so desperate for their drug that I had believed such flimsy lies. I went to the state police with everything that I had, but I had forgotten how crazy my story would sound to anyone who hadn't lived it. The agent that I spoke to promised that they would look into it. It was months before a pair of officers finally investigated the trail behind the teacher's house. Of course, since they went during the day, they found nothing to corroborate my testimony. The only result of their visit was that the people of Deer Chase now knew that I had betrayed their trust. I told myself that I was safe in the city, that none of my old neighbors would search me out and drive so far just for a broken promise. Of course, that was before last night, when I found a tiny glowing tick on my pillow. The mountains have a way of keeping secrets. I've been working search and rescue in the Blue Ridge section of the Appalachians for 22 years now. Most folks picture search and rescue work as heroic rescues with grateful families and maybe the occasional unfortunate fatality. But they don't know about the other things, the cases that don't make the papers, the reports that get quietly filed away, the experiences that we don't talk about at the annual department cookout. My name is Morgan Caldwell. What I'm about to share with you are the cases that still keep me up at night. I'm not writing this for sympathy or attention. Consider it a warning. The mountains are beautiful, but they're also ancient and unforgiving. They don't care about your hiking plans or your Instagram photos. They've been here long before us, and they'll be here long after. My first truly disturbing case happened in 2005. A family of 4, the Whitakers, had gone camping in a remote section of the mountains. The father, Buford, mother Geneva, and their children, Silas and Mercy. They were experienced outdoors people who had been camping in these mountains for years. On their 3rd day, however, Mercy wandered away from their campsite while Geneva was cooking breakfast. The family searched for hours before calling it in. By the time that our team arrived, Mercy had been missing for nearly 7 hours. We organized a standard grid search radiating out from the last known position. I was paired with Deputy Sheriff Virgil Monroe, an old-timer who had been born and raised in these hills. As we swept our assigned sector, Virgil kept shaking his head. We ain't gonna find that little girl. Not in this part of the woods," he said, his voice low. "What makes you say that?" I asked, still relatively new to the job and the region. Virgil stopped, leaning on a gnarled hickory walking stick that he had carved himself. "This part of the mountains, it ain't right. Locals know better than to camp here, especially with youngins." I rolled my eyes, thinking it was just local superstition, but Virgil was dead serious. "Back in the mining days, there was a collapse in the shaft that runs under this section. Trapped a bunch of men inside. Company said it was too dangerous to recover the bodies, so they sealed it up. Folks say that those miners still walk these woods, looking for children to take their place so that they can finally rest." I was about to dismiss his story when we had heard it, a child's laugh coming from deeper in the woods. We both took off running toward the sound. The terrain was rough, all steep slopes and dense undergrowth. The laugh came again, farther up ahead. We followed that sound for nearly 2 miles, far outside our assigned search grid. Eventually, we came to the mouth of a small cave, partially hidden by bushes. The opening was just big enough for a child to slip through, or a slender adult if they were determined. Virgil grabbed my arm when I moved toward it. "Don't go in there. That ain't natural." I shook him off. "If Mercy's in there, we need to get her out." The cave entrance opened into a narrow passage that forced me to crouch. The air inside was surprisingly cold and smelled of wet limestone and something else. Something metallic and unpleasant. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing childish drawings scratched into the rock walls, stick figures holding hands, a house, the sun, and more disturbing images. long, thin figures without faces, surrounding smaller figures that I assumed represented children. The passage eventually widened into a small chamber, and there, sitting cross-legged in the center, was Mercy Whitaker. She was humming softly to herself, seemingly unharmed. "Mercy," I called softly, trying not to startle her. She looked up, but not at me, at something behind me. "He said you'd come," she said matter-of-factly. "He said you would try to take me back, but I don't want to go. I like it here with my new friends." I turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty passage that I had come through. When I looked back at Mercy, she was standing, her small face suddenly angry. "They need me," she shouted. "The Hollow Men need me to help them find their way out." I approached her slowly, hands out in a non-threatening gesture. "Your mom and dad need you too, Mercy. They're very worried about you." She took a step back. "They shouldn't have brought me here. This place isn't for the living. That's what my friend said." I lunged forward and grabbed her before she could retreat deeper into the cave. She fought like a wild animal, scratching and biting, screaming words that no 6-year-old should know. It took all my strength to carry her thrashing body back through the passage. When we emerged into the sunlight, Virgil was waiting with a satellite phone, already calling in our position. Mercy went limp in my arms as soon as we had exited the cave, falling into what the paramedics would later call a dissociative state. The official report listed the incident as a case of a lost child suffering from dehydration and stress-induced hallucinations. It mentioned nothing about the drawings in the cave or the words that Mercy had spoken. The Whitakers had moved away from the area shortly after. I ran into Geneva at a gas station about a year later, and she told me that Mercy had no memory of what had happened during those hours that she was missing. But sometimes Geneva would find her daughter talking to empty corners of rooms, or drawing pictures of men with hollow eyes and long, thin limbs. "We don't camp anymore," Geneva told me, her voice brittle with forced cheerfulness. "Buford's taken up golf instead." In November 2009, a local hunter named Henry Eldrith went missing during the first week of deer season. Henry was 62, a lifelong resident who knew these mountains better than most game wardens. His wife reported him missing when he didn't return to their cabin by nightfall. When search and rescue was activated the next morning, I specifically requested to be on the team. I had known Henry for years. He had helped train some of our newer members on wilderness navigation and had even guided me to my first buck when I had moved to the area. What made his disappearance particularly concerning was that Henry had a very specific hunting routine. He would set up in the same deer stand, a platform that he had built in a large oak tree overlooking a natural funnel between two ridges, and he would stay there until dusk. He wasn't the type to go wandering off trail. We found his truck parked at his usual spot, a small pull-off on an old logging road. His rifle and pack were still in his deer stand, along with a thermos of coffee that was still warm when we found it. The only sign that something had gone wrong was a smear of blood on the wooden platform and drag marks leading away from the tree. The most obvious explanation was that Henry had shot a deer, climbed down to field dress it, and somehow gotten injured in the process. Perhaps he had fallen and hit his head or suffered a heart attack. But that didn't explain why he would have left his rifle behind, or why there was blood in the stand itself rather than on the ground below. We followed the drag marks, which headed straight downhill through dense mountain laurel thickets, away from any established trail. The blood sign was minimal, just occasional droplets rather than the heavy trail that you would expect from a serious injury. About half a mile from the deer stand, the drag marks and blood trail ended at the edge of a small and stagnant pond, what locals call a sinkhole, formed when underground limestone caves collapse and fill with water. The surface was coated with a film of brown duckweed, completely undisturbed. We set up a perimeter and called in the dive team from Johnson County. While waiting for them to arrive, I walked the circumference of the pond, looking for any sign that Henry might have pulled himself out and continued on. And that's when I noticed carvings on a nearby beech tree. Fresh carvings, the exposed wood still light-colored and leaking sap. They depicted a crude stick figure with a distended belly, surrounded by smaller figures that seemed to be bowing down to it. Below the carvings, someone had written, "The sink wants more." I called over our team's forensic photographer to document the carvings before showing the others. Something about them disturbed me deeply, particularly because the handwriting looked eerily similar to Henry's distinctive blocky letters. When the dive team arrived, they entered the sinkhole with underwater lights and cameras. The pond was deeper than it appeared, nearly 40 feet at its center with numerous underwater caves branching off from the main chamber. The divers found no sign of Henry, but what they did find wedged in one of the underwater caves were the skeletal remains of at least 3 other individuals. One set was identified through dental records as belonging to a hiker who had disappeared back in 1998. The other 2 were too degraded for identification. The case took an even stranger turn 3 days later when a trail camera belonging to another hunter captured an image of what appeared to be Henry walking through the forest about 2 miles from where he had gone missing. The photo was taken at night, the infrared flash giving it a ghostly quality. The figure was clearly Henry, wearing the same flannel jacket and orange cap that he had had on when he disappeared, but something was wrong with his eyes. They reflected the camera's flash with an unusual triangular pupil shape, similar to a goat's. The search was redirected to that area, but no further sign of Henry was found. Weeks turned to months, and eventually his case was classified as a presumed wilderness fatality, though no body was ever recovered. A year to the day after Henry vanished, his wife Mabel called me in a panic. Somebody had been outside their cabin in the middle of the night, tapping on the windows and calling her name in Henry's voice. When she looked outside, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. "It looked like Henry," she told me, her voice shaking, "but all swollen up, like he had been in water for a long time. And his eyes," she trailed off. "What about his eyes?" "They weren't human. And he kept pointing back towards the woods like he wanted me to follow him." I drove out to check on her, but found nothing unusual around the property. I convinced myself it was just the grief and stress playing tricks on the elderly widow's mind. 2 days later, though, Mabel Eldrith disappeared. Her cabin was found undisturbed, dinner still warm on the stove, her reading glasses next to her favorite chair, the door locked from the inside. The only unusual detail was a trail of water on the floor, leading from the bathroom to the back door. Despite an extensive search, Mabel was never found. I still avoid that part of the forest. Sometimes during heavy rain, I think about that sinkhole, steadily filling with water from hidden underground streams, and I wonder what else might be down there in those lightless caves, waiting. In the summer of 2013, we received a call about 3 college students who had gone hiking and failed to return to their car by nightfall. They had planned a day hike to photograph the sunset from Lookout Point, a popular scenic overlook. By the time we mobilized the next morning, the students had been missing for nearly 18 hours. The weather had been clear, but temperatures at that elevation could drop significantly at night, raising concerns about hypothermia. We found their vehicle at the trailhead parking lot and began following the main trail. Everything seemed normal until we had reached a fork about 2 miles in. The left path continued toward Lookout Point, our assumed destination, while the right path led to what locals called Preacher's Ridge, a less traveled way named after an evangelical minister who had supposedly performed baptisms in a small stream there in the 1800s. What caught our attention was a pile of rocks at the fork, topped with a small handmade doll fashioned from twigs and twine. The doll had no face, just a blank space where the features should be. This wasn't a standard trail marking, and something about it felt off. On a hunch, I examined the ground around the fork and found fresh boot prints heading toward Preacher's Ridge rather than Lookout Point. We redirected our search accordingly. Preacher's Ridge was heavily overgrown, the trail barely visible in some places. As we climbed higher, the forest changed character. The usual mix of oak and hickory giving way to gnarled pines and ancient vines that formed a dense canopy overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. About a mile up this trail, we found a single hiking boot, identified later as belonging to one of the students, Aidan McNair. We continued climbing, finding occasional disturbing signs. A camera lens cap, a torn backpack strap, a water bottle with dark smudges that testing would later confirm as blood, but no clear trail indicating where the students had gone. Near the summit of the ridge, we came upon a small clearing with a large fire pit containing the ashes of a recent fire in the middle, and scattered around that fire pit were Polaroid photos. I still remember the sick feeling in my stomach as I picked up those photos. Each one showed one of the missing students. In the first set, they were smiling, posing against the backdrop of the forest. Normal vacation shots. But each subsequent photograph showed them looking increasingly distressed. In the final images, they were bound to trees with vines and rope, their faces contorted in terror. And standing behind them, partially obscured by shadow, was a tall figure wearing what appeared to be a deer skull as a mask. We immediately called for backup, including armed sheriff's deputies. While waiting, we conducted a careful search of the area and found a narrow path leading away from the fire pit toward the eastern face of the ridge. The path ended at the entrance to a small cave. The ground outside was disturbed with clear signs of a struggle, and inside we found more disturbing evidence. A smashed cell phone and walls lined with hundreds of twig dolls similar to the one that we had found at the trail fork. There was no sign of the students themselves until we had ventured deeper into the cave. In a small chamber at the back, illuminated by a shaft of light from a crack in the ceiling, we found 3 sets of clothes, neatly folded and stacked in separate piles, each topped with a driver's license. Aiden's, Delilah's, and Jasper's, the college students. The clothes showed no signs of violence, no tears or bloodstains. It was as if the students had simply stepped out of them and walked away. A thorough search of the surrounding area yielded nothing. No bodies, no further trails, no indication of where they might have gone. It was as if they had simply vanished from inside that cave. The investigation took a bizarre turn when authorities ran background checks on the missing students. They discovered that all 3 had been active on an online forum dedicated to local folklore and occult practices. In the weeks before their disappearance, they had posted extensively about something that they called the Faceless Shepherd of Preacher's Ridge. According to their research, the original preacher for whom the ridge was named had not been a Christian minister at all, but the leader of a small secretive cult that practiced rituals aimed at communicating with an entity they described as the Watcher in the Woods. The cult had allegedly disappeared during a harsh winter in 1879, with locals claiming that they had walked into the hills and never returned. The students appeared to have been attempting to recreate one of these rituals. Their final forum post made the day before their hike read, "Tomorrow we meet the shepherd. If the old accounts are true, he will take our faces and give us new ones. We will become part of the watching woods." And despite one of the largest search operations in county history involving multiple agencies and lasting nearly 3 weeks, no trace of the students were ever found. The case remained open but inactive until October of the following year, when a local resident stated that he saw 3 figures standing motionless among the trees on his property near Preacher's Ridge. They were unclothed, their skin pale to the point of translucence, their heads tilted at identical unnatural angles. Where their faces should have been were only smooth, blank expanses of skin. The resident who sent in the call was often known to cry wolf, and authorities officially dismissed it as a hoax when they went and swept the property, finding nothing. But I swear sometimes when I'm working in that part of the forest, I feel like I'm being watched by eyes that I cannot see. Not all of my disturbing experiences involve missing persons. Sometimes we find exactly who we're looking for and wish that we hadn't. In February of 2016, we were called to assist in a wellness check at a remote cabin on the outskirts of Boone County. The resident, Cordell Ledbetter, was an elderly recluse who hadn't been seen in town for several weeks. A distant relative had requested the check after his phone went unanswered for days. The cabin was located at the end of a long dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. Recent snow and ice storms had made it impassable by vehicle, forcing us to hike the last mile in on foot. From the outside, the cabin appeared abandoned. Windows were dark and snow had piled undisturbed on the porch. The local deputy who had come along with me knocked repeatedly while announcing police presence but received no response. When we entered, the interior was freezing, the wood stove long gone cold. A layer of dust covered most surfaces, suggesting Ledbetter hadn't been active in the main living area for some time. However, there were no signs of struggle or foul play. Maybe you went to stay with somebody for the winter, I suggested, though we all knew Ledbetter was notorious for refusing to leave his property under any circumstances. We were about to depart when the deputy noticed something odd about the kitchen floor. A small braided rug had been partially moved aside, revealing the edge of what appeared to be a trapdoor. And did anybody know that Ledbetter had a cellar? He asked. None of us had heard of one. The cabin was over 100 years old, built by Ledbetter's grandfather, and modifications were common in such structures. Still though, something about the partially revealed door made my skin crawl. The deputy pulled the rug away completely and found an iron ring set into the wooden door. When he pulled, the door opened with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a set of crude steps descending into the darkness. The smell that rose from below was immediate and overwhelming, a putrid mix of decay, urine, and something else, something chemical and sharp that burned the nostrils. "Christ almighty," the deputy muttered, stepping back and covering his nose with his sleeve. Protocol dictated that we investigate, despite every instinct telling us to close that door and walk away. The deputy went first, a flashlight in one hand and a weapon in the other. I followed close behind. The cellar was larger than I expected, extending well beyond the footprint of the cabin above. The ceiling was low, forcing us to stoop, and the earthen floor was damp and uneven. Our flashlight beams revealed rough stone walls covered in what looked like streaks of dried blood. But it was what we found at the far end of the cellar that haunts me still. A metal bed frame had been bolted to the floor, fitted with leather restraints at the corners. Beside it stood a crude workbench littered with tools, scalpels, bone saws, needles, and jars containing preserved specimens. I couldn't immediately identify them. And hanging from hooks in the ceiling were what appeared at first glance to be animal hides. It took several moments for my brain to process what I was actually seeing. Human skins, carefully preserved and stretched, at least 6 complete specimens. At the center of this, a grotesque workshop sat Cordell Ledbetter in a hand-carved wooden chair. He was very much alive, though severely emaciated. His eyes, when they caught our flashlight beams, showed no surprise or shame, only annoyance at the interruption. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "This is family business." "What is this place, Ledbetter?" the deputy demanded, his weapon now trained directly on the old man. Ledbetter smiled, revealing black teeth. Oh, just continuing the work my daddy taught me and his daddy before him. The hollow men need new skins when the old ones wear out. Before the deputy could respond, Ledbetter lunged with unexpected speed, driving something sharp toward the deputy's midsection. He fired twice, the gunshots deafening in the confined space. Ledbetter collapsed, the crude bone knife he had been holding clattering to the floor. As he lay there dying, he kept smiling with that terrible smile. "Too late," he whispered. "They already have your scent now. They'll come looking for you when they get hungry again." And those were his last words. The subsequent investigation revealed horrors beyond imagination. Over the past 40 years at least, 26 hikers and campers had disappeared within a 50-mile radius of Ledbetter's cabin. In a hidden room accessible only through a narrow crawl space at the back of the cellar, investigators found personal effects belonging to at least 11 of these missing persons. They also found journals, dozens of them dating back to the 1850s, all written by Ledbetter men. The accounts detailed a family tradition of providing vessels for entities they called the Hollow Men, supposedly ancient spirits that lived in the deepest caves of these mountains and required human bodies to interact with the surface world. The process, described in meticulous and stomach-turning detail, involved capturing victims, keeping them alive while systematically removing their skin, and then preserving that skin through a combination of chemical treatments and occult rituals. What the journals didn't explain was what happened to the skinless bodies afterward, or why none were found on the property despite decades of this grotesque practice. Most disturbing of all was the final entry in Cordell Ledbetter's journal, dated just 3 days before our arrival. February 17th. "They're getting impatient. Say the vessels don't last like they used to. Need fresher skins, younger ones. Promise them the next search party that comes looking. They always send search parties eventually." I requested a transfer shortly after the Ledbetter case had concluded. My superiors denied it, citing my experience and knowledge to the region as too valuable to lose. But sometimes I wonder if there was another reason, if perhaps they needed someone who already knew too much to stay right where they were. In October 2019, a dense fog settled over the western slopes of the mountains and didn't lift for nearly a week. This wasn't unusual for the season, but what happened during that fog certainly was. It began with a routine call. An elderly couple, the Vances, had gone missing from their small farm near the edge of Cherokee National Forest. According to their daughter, they had called her the previous evening, sounding confused and claiming that people were walking in the fog outside of their home. When the daughter drove to check on them the next morning, the house was empty. The front door stood open, breakfast half prepared on the kitchen table. Their truck was still in the driveway, keys hanging on the hook by the door. Initial assumptions leaned toward the couple experiencing confusion. Both were in their late 70s and wandering into the nearby woods. But as our team began the search, something felt off from the start. The fog was oppressive, limiting visibility to less than 20 feet. Sounds behaved strangely in it. Voices seemed to come from the wrong directions, and several times team members reported hearing their names called by voices that didn't belong to anybody in our group. I was working with a new recruit, Nicole Goggins, a local who had recently returned after a stint in the military. As we swept through the field behind the Vance property, Nicole suddenly grabbed my arm. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing into the mist. About 50 feet ahead, barely visible through the swirling fog, was a figure standing motionless. It appeared to be watching us. "Hello?" I called out. "This is search and rescue. We're looking for Eustace and Dorothy Vance." The figure didn't respond or move. As we cautiously approached, it seemed to recede, maintaining the same distance regardless of how quickly we advanced. "It's leading us somewhere," Nicole murmured. I was about to argue when my radio crackled with static and then fell silent. Attempting to call the rest of the team yielded no response. We were effectively cut off. The logical course would have been to turn back, but something compelled us to follow that silent figure deeper into the fog. It led us through the field across a small stream and into the edge of the forest beyond the Vance property. We walked for what felt like hours, though my watch showed only 20 minutes had passed. The forest around us grew increasingly unfamiliar. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the fog revealed a tall stone structure similar to an obelisk. The figure that we had been following now stood underneath it. As we approached, the fog swirled and parted just enough for me to see that it wasn't a person at all, but a roughly human-shaped mass of twigs and branches bound together with what looked like human hair. "What the heck?" I muttered, instinctively reaching for my sidearm. "Morgan, look," Nicole whispered, pointing beyond the obelisk. Through gaps in the fog, I could make out more figures, dozens of them standing motionless among the trees surrounding the structure. Some appeared to be normal humans, while others were clearly constructed like the one that had led us here. And moving among them were two familiar shapes, Eustace and Dorothy Vance. They walked with strange, puppet-like movements, their eyes vacant and their expressions blank. Behind them, partially obscured by fog, loomed a much larger figure that seemed to be manipulating them, with thin strands that caught the light like spider silk. I raised my flashlight, trying to get a better look at this controlling entity, but Nicole knocked my arm down. "Don't," she hissed. "My grandmother used to talk about this. The fog people, if they know you can see them, they take you too." Before I could respond, a voice called out from behind us, the clear professional shout of another search and rescue officer. The fog people immediately retreated, including the Vances, vanishing into the mist between one blink and the next. Moments later, two of our team members emerged from the fog, explaining that they had been searching for us for nearly an hour after we had failed to respond to the radio calls. According to them, we had somehow wandered almost 2 miles off our assigned search grid. The official search for the Vances continued for another week without success. Their disappearance was eventually attributed to confusion followed by exposure and the harsh weather conditions. But only a few days later, one of our search and rescue team members discovered something about 5 miles off the Vance property. 2 crude effigies made of twigs and branches, bound with human hair, later confirmed to belong to the Vances. The effigies had been carefully arranged, sitting side by side on a fallen log, facing towards the mountains. Most disturbing of all, when the figures were moved, park rangers discovered that the log beneath them had been carefully hollowed out. Inside were human teeth, a complete set from 2 different individuals. I never told anybody else what Nicole and I saw in the fog that day, and Nicole herself left the search and rescue team shortly afterward, moving to Arizona where, as she put it, you can see for miles in every direction. Technology has changed search and rescue operations dramatically over the years, mostly for the better. Drones, GPS tracking, infrared cameras, all valuable tools that have helped save lives. But sometimes, technology reveals things that we might be better off not seeing. In spring 2022, a professional wildlife photographer named Julian Kincaid went missing while documenting the annual firefly display in a remote section of the Great Smoky Mountains. This rare natural phenomenon, where thousands of fireflies blink in unison, attracts photographers from around the world during the 2-week period when it occurs. Kincaid had permits to be in a restricted area after dark, and park rangers became concerned when he failed to return to his designated parking area by morning. His campsite was found undisturbed, his equipment still set up, including a sophisticated camera trap designed to capture time-lapse images of the fireflies throughout the night. Our team was called in when initial searches by park rangers found no sign of Kincaid on any of the established trails. I was interested in the case because the area where he had disappeared was one that I knew well, a section of old-growth forest that had always felt slightly off to me, though I had never experienced anything overtly supernatural there. When we arrived at the campsite, everything looked normal. His tent was properly secured, his sleeping bag laid out inside. The camera trap was still operational, set up on a tripod facing a small clearing where fireflies were known to congregate. The memory card showed that it had captured images throughout the night, taking one shot every 30 seconds from dusk until dawn. While the rest of the team began a standard search pattern, I stayed behind to review the camera's footage, hoping that it might provide clues to where Kincaid had went. The first few hours of images showed nothing unusual, just the gradual darkening of the forest as night fell, occasionally illuminated by the flashing of fireflies. Kincaid himself appeared in a few frames, making adjustments to the camera. But at around 1:30 in the morning, something changed. The firefly activity suddenly ceased, as if something had startled them. And at the edge of the frame, barely visible, a pale figure seemed to be watching from behind a tree. In subsequent images, the figure moved gradually closer to the center of the clearing. It was humanoid but wrong somehow, too tall and thin, its proportions subtly distorted. Its face, when it finally turned toward the camera, appeared to be not a face at all but a shifting mass of light that mimicked facial features without quite achieving them. At 2:17, Kincaid entered the frame again. He appeared to be looking directly at the entity, though his back was to the camera. He extended his hand as if in greeting or perhaps to touch the thing. The next image showed only empty forest. Both Kincaid and the entity had vanished. The remaining photos captured nothing unusual until dawn broke, just an empty clearing occasionally illuminated by the flashlights of the first park rangers to arrive at the scene. I downloaded the images to my phone and caught up with the rest of the team, showing them what I had found. Most were skeptical, suggesting lens flare or light pollution from distant sources could explain the strange figure. The search continued for 3 days with no sign of Julian. No blood, no clothing, no trail indicating which direction he might have gone in. It was as if he had simply stepped out of our reality. On the 4th day, as we were preparing to scale back the operation, I made a discovery that still gives me nightmares. In a small ravine about a half-mile from the campsite, I found Kincaid's notebook. The final entry, timestamped at 2:15 a.m. on the night he disappeared, read, "I can see them now. The light creatures, they've been here all along, hiding in the patterns of the fireflies. They say they can show me how to photograph the spaces between moments. All I have to do is follow them into the light." Below this was a crude drawing that matched the entity captured by the camera trap. As I was reading, my phone suddenly began cycling through the images that I had downloaded from Kincaid's camera, though I hadn't touched it. It stopped on the 2:17 a.m. image, the last one showing Kincaid and the entity. And as I watched, horrified, the image zoomed in on its own, focusing on the entity's face. The shifting lights resolved into recognizable features for just a moment, features that belonged to Julian Kincaid. And then the screen went black. The battery completely drained despite having been at 90% moments before. Julian was never found. His case remains open, classified as a suspected wilderness accident or an animal attack. His camera, which I personally turned over to park rangers, was reported missing from the evidence locker a week later. The backup copies of the images which had been uploaded to the investigation database were corrupted beyond recovery. My final and perhaps most disturbing case began as a routine operation in January of 2023. A historic hunting lodge on private property near the Tennessee border had been renovated as a boutique retreat center for corporate executives. During their first winter event, a leadership summit for technology, 3 attendees vanished overnight. The lodge's manager, Bart Quillen, reported that the missing persons were all part of the company, the CFO, VP, and Director of Operations. They had been present at dinner but failed to appear for breakfast the following morning. Their room showed no signs of disturbance. Personal items, including phones and wallets, were still in place. Initial assumptions leaned toward the executives having gone for an early morning hike despite warnings about the harsh weather conditions. The property backed up to thousands of acres of wilderness, with several unmarked trails leading into the national forest. When I arrived with my team, a light snow was falling, quickly covering any tracks that might have been left. The temperature had dropped to the low teens overnight, making exposure a serious concern if the executives were indeed outdoors. The lodge itself was an impressive structure built in the 1890s by a lumber baron named Oben Prescott, and it featured mounted trophies from a century of different hunting expeditions. The renovations had added modern amenities while preserving the rustic character that made the place both charming and slightly unnerving. Bart gave us a tour of the property, explaining that the lodge had been abandoned for nearly 30 years before he had purchased it 3 years ago. Now the locals were superstitious about it, he said with a dismissive wave. Something about Prescott's hunting practices, claimed that he didn't hunt animals. When I pressed him on this, he shrugged. Oh, mountain folklore. Prescott supposedly had a taste for exotic game, whatever that meant. The stories say he kept trophies from human victims in a hidden room somewhere in the lodge, but we've renovated every inch of the place and never found anything like that. We organized a standard search pattern focusing first on the marked trails leading from the lodge into the surrounding forest. Meanwhile, I interviewed the remaining executives and staff members about the previous evening. A consistent detail emerged. During dinner, the CFO, Tamara, had mentioned finding a hidden door behind a bookcase in the library. A real-life secret passage, as she had described it. According to witnesses, she had been excited about exploring it further after dinner, and had invited Gregory, the VP, and Lucinda, the director, to join her. When I had asked Bart about this hidden door, he seemed very confused. There's no hidden door in the library. We gutted that room down to the studs during renovation. I decided to inspect the library myself. It was a handsome room lined with built-in bookshelves and dominated by a stone fireplace. A careful examination of the shelving revealed nothing unusual until I noticed something odd about the pattern of the wooden floorboards near the eastern wall. They were slightly newer than the surrounding wood, as if that section had been replaced more recently. I ran my hands along the bookshelf covering that wall, feeling for any irregularities. Near the bottom shelf, my fingers caught on a small metal lever disguised as a decorative book. When pulled, it released a catch, and a section of the bookcase swung inward with surprising smoothness. Behind it, a passage carved directly into the stone foundation of the lodge. The air that wafted out was cold and damp, with an unpleasant musty odor that reminded me of neglected root cellars and forgotten tombs. I called for backup before entering, now wanting to repeat the mistakes of the missing executives. 2 of my team members arrived with powerful flashlights and weapons drawn, standard protocol when entering unknown enclosed spaces during a search. The passage descended via rough stone steps that looked much older than the lodge itself, as if the building had been constructed around a pre-existing structure. The walls were damp with seeping groundwater, and occasional niches had been carved into them, each containing small, peculiar objects, twisted metal shapes, bundles of dried herbs tied with human hair, and what appeared to be very old small bones. After descending about 30 feet, the passage opened into a large chamber that immediately set my nerves on edge. Unlike the crude passage, this room had been finished with dressed stone and elaborate carvings. The ceiling arched overhead, supported by columns inscribed with symbols I didn't recognize but instinctively disliked. In the center of the chamber stood a large stone table, its surface stained dark brown in a way that suggested centuries of spilled blood. Surrounding it were 13 high-backed wooden chairs arranged in a perfect oval. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each chair featured intricate carvings of elongated human figures engaged in what appeared to be hunting activities, though their prey was deliberately obscured. Most disturbing were the trophies mounted on the walls. Dozens of taxidermied heads, many recognizably animal, deer, bear, mountain lion, but others more ambiguous. They had been altered or combined in ways that made classification impossible. Creatures with too many eyes or misplaced features, or anatomical structures that had no natural counterpart, and occupying 3 of the chairs sitting perfectly upright with vacant expressions, were Tamara, Gregory, and Lucinda. "Hello?" I called cautiously, approaching with my flashlight beam directed at their faces. "Are you all right?" None responded or showed any sign of registering my presence. Their eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dilated despite the bright light. They breathed shallowly and had pulses when I checked, but appeared to be in some kind of trance or a catatonic state. As we prepared to move them, I noticed something on the stone altar. A leather-bound book open to a page filled with handwritten text in faded brown ink. The language was not English, but scattered throughout were diagrams of human figures with their heads replaced by various animals. One of my team members began to read aloud from the text, stumbling over the strange syllables. I immediately slapped the book closed, remembering too many folktales about the danger of reading unknown incantations. "Let's get these people out of here first," I said firmly. "Then we can figure out what happened." As we turned to help the executives, the door that we had entered through suddenly swung shut with a definitive boom that echoed throughout the chamber. At the same moment, the 3 executives rose in perfect unison, their movements mechanical and unnatural. "The gathering is not complete," they said in perfect unison, their voices flat and emotionless. "The Prescott hunt requires 13. You will stay." One of my team members drew his sidearm, but before he could speak, something heavy struck the back of my head. As consciousness faded, I caught a glimpse of Bart standing over me, holding what looked like an antique hunting club. "Sorry about this," he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "But my family traditions must be maintained. My grandfather would be so disappointed if we didn't continue the hunt." I awoke what seemed like hours later, my hands and feet bound to one of the ornate chairs. My team members were restrained nearby. The executives remained seated in their chairs, still in that unnerving trance state. The 7 more chairs had been filled with lodge staff members, all wearing the same vacant expression. Bart stood by the altar, now dressed in an outdated hunting outfit that might have been fashionable in the 1800s. He was reading from a leather book, his voice rising and falling in a chanting cadence that made my skin crawl. "The traditional Prescott hunt has always required 13 participants," he explained conversationally during a pause in his chanting. 9 to serve as vessels for the Ancient Ones, 3 to serve as quarry, and 1 to serve as master of the hunt. He gestured to these strange trophies on the walls. "My great-grandfather discovered that certain entities from the deeper woods would exchange their essence, their power, for the experience of hunting in human form. They take temporary possession of willing vessels to participate in the hunt. Those people don't look willing," I managed to say through a mouth that felt stuffed with cotton, and Bart smiled. "A simple potion and their evening brandy was all it took to make them receptive. They've been prepared as vessels. You and your colleagues, however, will serve as quarry." He returned to his chanting, and I watched in horror as something began to happen to the seated figures. Their features seemed to ripple and distort as if something else was pushing outward from inside them. Their skin stretched and reformed, taking on characteristics of the mounted trophies on the walls. Antlers sprouting from temples, eyes multiplying or changing shape, teeth elongating into fangs or tusks. I struggled against my bonds, the rough rope cutting into my wrists. Beside me, my team member Rod had managed to work one hand partially free and was fumbling with something in his pocket. Just as Bart reached what seemed to be the climax of his chant, Rod broke free and lunged at him, revealing what he had been reaching for, a road flare from his emergency kit. He struck it against the stone altar in the chamber filled with harsh red light and caustic smoke. The effect on the transforming figures was immediate and dramatic. They recoiled from the light, their partially altered forms spasming as if in pain. Bart shouted in a language that I didn't understand, trying to continue the ritual, but the damage had been done. In the confusion, I managed to tip my chair over, breaking it against the stone floor. The ancient wood, despite its elaborate craftsmanship, was brittle with age and shattered on impact. I freed myself from the ropes and helped release my other teammate. What followed was chaos. The entities that had been emerging through the bodies of the lodge occupants were now caught in a halfway state, neither fully manifested nor fully retreated. They stumbled about the chamber, howling in voices that contained both human pain and inhuman rage. Bart had produced an antique hunting rifle and was trying to restore order, shouting phrases from the book. I tackled him to the ground, sending the rifle skittering across the stone floor. "You fool," he spat, struggling beneath me. "The ritual can't be interrupted at this stage. You've doomed us all." Before I could respond, one of the partially transformed creatures, I think it had been Tamara, grabbed Bart and lifted him effortlessly into the air. Her face had elongated into something resembling a deer's snout, but with rows of shark-like teeth that had no place on an herbivore. What happened next is something that I've tried to forget. The transformed lodge occupants, driven mad by their incomplete metamorphosis, turned on Bart and then on each other. The chamber became a battleground as creatures with impossible forms tore at each other with claws and teeth that shouldn't exist in nature. My team and I retreated toward the door, which had swung open when the ritual had been disrupted. As we backed up the staircase, I saw Bart's body being dismembered by the very entities that he had sought to bind to his service. We managed to escape the lodge and call for backup. By the time that additional forces arrived, the building was engulfed in flames. We never determined the exact cause of the fire. Perhaps Rod's flare had ignited something, or perhaps the supernatural energies unleashed by the interrupted ritual had combusted on their own. The official report listed the incident as a tragic accident. Obviously, somewhat fishy in hindsight, but things have a way of being covered up around these parts. So yeah, that's all that I have for now. I don't expect everybody to believe these accounts. Most days, I'm not sure I believe them myself. But I do know that this part of the country is very old. It holds secrets that defy conventional explanation. Pockets of strangeness where the normal rules seem to fray around the edges.